Amanda, you want to take us live? We're live. Okay, great. Thank you. Call the committee back to order. Two things. We're a little late getting started, but we're also ahead of schedule. So I guess that's a good thing. So the next topic on the agenda is opening remarks from the Department of Transportation. Director, glad you could join us a little early.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's our pleasure. Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure this is.
It has to be read. We've had some problems with them. And while they're helping us so that the people out in the virtual land understand, while we have our own IT people here, the Wyoming Public Broadcasting System, PBS, has been helping us too. So thank you, gentlemen. And Casper College. This is great. It just shows you what it takes to run the electronics for these meetings. So General, proceed.
Okay,
please.
thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Luke Reiner, Director of WYDOT. Certainly, it is our pleasure to be here today, and we'll look forward to the next day and a half with you. In terms of opening remarks, I think all of you should have a short presentation, and I'll just walk you through that in terms of opening remarks. And so, if you look at the pictures on slide 1, you know, that really depicts a big event for us this year, the March 2021 snowstorms. And I just share that because, continue to try and highlight the exceptional work of the men and women at WYDOT. So certainly one of our rotaries there on the left, Trooper Bauer there directing traffic on I-25, and a couple of our TMC, or our Transportation Management Center operators on the bottom right. I share a story with you on the Transportation Management Center is that storm hit, and really it became very difficult for people to travel in Cheyenne. You know that was sort of some of you were there or trying to get back. And so we did have the pleasure here just last week of handing out some awards to our TMC operators and / dispatch. Some of them spent over 30 hours there that first shift because we couldn't get them home. And then we actually fired up one of our snowcats and started rotating people in and out, because that is the center that really dispatches all of our plows, dispatches our patrolmen, and keeps track around the clock of what's going on across the state. So nice job on their part. If you flip to the next slide, then page number 2, there's a snowplow on the top left that we eventually did get pulled out. The interesting thing when you talk to the drivers is that you put that blade down, that snow will just suck you in. And so it was an interesting storm. You can see some other action shots there of us clearing the road. I'll tell you, in terms of snow operations, it would also report to you, we had 7 avalanches that we set off over in the Teton Pass area, so over Glory Bowl. And the typically we use sort of a Swedish invention, a gas X they call it, to explode it. But for the old artillerymen in here, the WYDOT still is the proud owner of a 10 Deuce that still works. And so those from time to time is used to start an avalanche to good effect. And then would also share if you remember, last fall, we implemented a new Wyoming authorized travel system. And as we watched and tracked that through this winter season, really it worked very well. So hopefully many of you were signed up for that, received the appropriate notifications, and the reports that we got back were good on that one. We are tweaking one issue with our rolling closure portion of the Wyoming authorized travel. During that big snowstorm, we did really end up with a mess in Evanston, largely because while Utah did a nice job of saying the roads are closed in Nebraska, they did not shut down the traffic. So we are working hard with Utah for them to just stop pushing the trucks because Evanston became more crowded than we would have wished. So we are actively working that issue as we speak. If you hear about it, talk to the mayors along that route and
Mr.
work
Co-Chair,
through those issues.
So Director, specific to the southwest part of the state, in an incident like that, I'm wondering, I've heard a time or two people bring up the idea of parking. What would that take, and would it really, what sort of an investment are you talking about if the state were to entertain an ability to park some trucks?
Director?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, we are in the process actually right now as we speak, adding 200 truck parking spots to the I-80 corridor. Now, most of those are on the southeast portion. The mayor asked me the same thing for Evanston. So we're really sort of taking that under advisement about, hey, what would that look like? Because, Rock Springs has got some nice capabilities, and they actually start funneling trucks into their fairgrounds. And that has turned out to be a fairly good parking area in those big storms. But Evanston does not have anything like that. So really, Mr. Chairman, I think I owe an answer in terms of the exact dollar figure there, but how that would work. But certainly in that big storm, that was required.
Mr. Co-Chair.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Director, there's a couple of things over there in the southwest that I would just really appreciate your consideration on. And that is one of them, because that really hit home to understand that we got all these trucks coming, and maybe Utah can't stop them all and nowhere to put them. And then the second piece in that part of the world is an effort that you've already, I think, communicated with a group regarding, and that's that trail system push that they're trying to do over in the southwest. And that's really intriguing to me. So before we got down the river, and I forgot to just hone in on the southwest and Evanston in particular, would really appreciate, maybe by next meeting, you can let us know more about those issues. So,
yeah, and absolutely.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Director, if I could, I think to get to the co-chairman's first question, though, about what is it costing to put the 100 truck parking in at Fort Steele? About what's the cost there? Because I know you don't have to buy the land, you already have the land, but just curious.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I need to get back with you on that one.
Okay.
Before I give you a number that's not correct.
All right, thank you. Okay,
Yeah,
continue.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director. I just have a question about what other states do, because I know that some states have signage along the interstate that lets truckers and other people know what's available ahead, like there's 30 spaces. And so I don't know, has there been any discussion about that? Because I've seen some of the videos of some of these truckers, and what happens is they don't realize that the conditions 30 miles down the road are going to be as severe as they are, or whatever it is. As much as we have signage on the interstate, I also know that the parking is an issue, and I know that you're looking to address it, but is there any possibility of us moving forward with some sort of system like that, where we're informing truckers 100 miles down the road that there's 30 spots available type thing?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Baker, I drove through Kansas just a couple weeks ago, and certainly they had that, how many truck parks were available in the next spot. It is a national issue in that regard. Right now, it is something we can add to the list. We are not actively looking at trying to identify in real time how many parking spots are there. There's some real difficulties with that, but parking across an entire freight corridor is certainly an issue, and we'll keep working it. And so whether that's the best solution for us right now, I can't tell you for sure, but I do know working with, we'll work with the Wyoming Trucking Association. I actually do sit on a national freight committee, and that is truck parking is one of the issues that we are working to address. Okay, thank you. As I continue, then, if you flip over to page 3, I did want to just report back to you on a customer satisfaction survey that we do every 2 years. And we did receive the results of that here about 6 weeks ago, and we did push them out. And I'll just share with you some of the highlights because we were actually fairly pleased with the results. So in terms of the overall stewardship of the transportation system, there was, over an 80% satisfaction rating, which we deem as good. If 80% of people are satisfied with what we're doing there. Some specific areas of, hey, really nice job. Our driver services in terms of customer satisfaction, their approval rating went up in terms of their courtesy and their promptness. And you can see the results there on the slide. And I was really just even based on the whole issue with COVID and masks, it was just nice to see those results coming back in real time from constituents and what they experienced. The highway patrol, really the same type of response was their satisfaction rating for the highway patrol was high. And if you had the fortunate experience to be pulled over, to have a chance to talk to the trooper about your personal driving habits, then your satisfaction rating actually went higher and you were more happy with their professionalism.
Mr. Chairman, the speaker had me till he went to that satisfaction rates increase after contact with the Highway Patrol.
So that, yep, that is. Mr. Chairman, I agree. Yes. All right, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. So the bottom bullet on page 3, there were some downward trends. Certainly the highway conditions approval rating went down, as did the satisfaction of the maintenance. And as we looked at it, you all know the challenges we have with funding, and I directly relate some of that satisfaction to the funding challenges we have. As moving on to page number 4, just a quick update on COVID. I'm very pleased with how YDOT stayed operational during the COVID-19 experience. And my biggest fear was losing crews and not being able to plow roads or maintain roads to satisfaction, not being able to open a road because we didn't have people available because they were sick, or losing entire driver services offices and not being able to provide driver's licenses. And that didn't happen. And so mask discipline remained good throughout our force. It was important for us to do that just in terms of force protection. And I'm happy that we're coming out of that period of our life, as I expect all of you are. And so off we go. In terms of bringing back YDOT employees to the office, the expectation is we'll have everybody back in their seat 1 July or new telework agreement. So right now, those of our force that are teleworking under an emergency agreement, and that comes to an end here soon. And so effective 1 July, that'll be the conditions. In terms of transitioning really from now to there, right now, if you go to YDOT facility, masks are optional. There's a couple exceptions. We have a high risk time each week in certain of our driver services. They're based on the clientele. We still require a mask, and we're still authorizing mask required for driving tests because of the close proximity in the vehicle. So that's current situation with COVID, but continue to operate in that environment. If you flip over then to page 5, here's just some thoughts on budget. And I know we'll have a complete budget presentation tomorrow, but probably these things will not be discussed in the YDOT budget per se. But we are working on our fiscal year 22 budget. As you all know, we do a yearly budget based on the Transportation Commission, and that our fiscal year is the federal fiscal year because of the large percentage of federal money that we receive. So we'll ask our commission to approve the fiscal year 22 budget in the September meeting of the Transportation Commission. Good news on rest areas. We did close those down last year, about 10 of them, based on close proximity to other areas to take a break. Based on available federal funding, we anticipate opening 9 of those, with the exception of Fort Steele. That one will stay closed because of the ongoing construction. And we should have those open by the week before Memorial Day. And then the other,
Mr. Chairman,
Please, Senator.
on rest areas, I thought I read that the governor said he was going to finance some of that. And I was curious as to whether he did and for how long was he financing the rest areas startup.
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, so that's still an ongoing process, but what we anticipate is available rescue dollars to help facilitate that, really in the area of probably tourism or some other area. And so at a minimum, really the tourist season for this year, the maximum probably 4 years. So depending on the will of, really, I believe in the end, probably the governor and the legislature.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chairman.
So, Director, I just wanted to say that whatever efforts you made to coordinate with others to get those open back up probably saved me from a beating. Maybe some of the other legislators here, people certainly paid attention to that one. But on a serious note, it has given me an opportunity to really think about that, and it makes you wonder if we couldn't come up with a different model. I think it's probably tough to hire part-time people. On the other hand, 4 months out of the year would be a lot better than nothing. So anyway, it gives us an opportunity to maybe think about it. Director, thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Mr.
Please.
Co-Chairman, I agree. I think, Chugwater was a pretty good model last year because they came up with some innovative funding for really the tourist season, and it worked good. Our preference is to have them open because, empty buildings are just, they're not conducive to healthy buildings in my mind. And I think there's a service that's required there at the rest areas. Moving on then, so snow removal was another area where we said, hey, we're gonna cut back a little bit on that. As we track that throughout this last year, all indications are that we met the expectations of your constituents and kept the roads open in a satisfactory manner. Now, in some areas there was a light year, but as we sort of tweak that a little bit, I think that the results were good and supportable, and we'll keep that same model for next year as we start looking ahead. In terms of the federal budget, just a couple things to report to you there. Some of this would be old news, but in terms of the supplemental appropriation associated with the FAST Act reauthorization this last year. So that's the bill from whence, every year we get our federal funding, usually about $280 million. They did send us $63.5 million in COVID relief. That has all been allocated and it's going to roads and support of roads. In terms
Director,
of
with that money from the CARES Act, the 63.5 million, were those projects you had delayed, or were they ones that you could use that money that were ready to go? I know there's a planning process and just.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, those were all projects that we pulled forward on the STIP, and they had not been the delayed projects. They were projects that we could immediately do and turn on.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir. In terms of the American Rescue Plan, certainly, lots of discussion on that rescue plan about road ahead, and lots of submissions to the governor and submissions to you as a body. And I believe that the special session coming up to discuss that. In terms of YDOT, we did make some suggestions. Certainly one was in the area of the capacity purchase agreement in terms of the aeronautics portion, because of the effect of COVID on that area and the significant economic impact of air travel in our various cities. And that was for the 5 cities that are involved in the CPA. And then we did request $3.5 million in backfill of COVID reduction in funding. We did submit a list of roads to be worked on. Now, as we read, the details in the plan, it really looks like the only amount that you could spend on horizontal transportation systems is the amount equal to the reduction in revenue caused by COVID. For YDOT right now, that's sitting at about $3.5 million. So not a huge amount of money when it comes to roads. We really, while we had a dramatic reduction when COVID started, I tell you at the end, we really climbed out of that. And at the end of the year, we were about 1% down in terms of revenue. So while that was a good news coming up, it's not a good news when you start trying to use and leverage some of those available federal dollars. There's some other areas that were requested specifically in RIS and WyoLink, and I think there'll be some more discussion of that as we walk through discussions today. In terms of the FAST Act reauthorization, so remember the FAST Act is the act that every year gives us our formula money, and it's where we get our federal money every year. That's typically a 5-year bill. We're on the 6th year. It looks like this current administration will pass a reauthorization act of that this year. There is an earmark that's available both on the appropriation side and the authorization side of that bill. However, Wyoming delegation is not participating in that, and so there's no earmarks for Wyoming as you look at that list of earmarks that came out. In terms of the American Jobs Plan, which is really the Biden infrastructure plan, that one is still certainly not passed our federal Congress, and we don't know what that will look like. But as that started, the request came through channels for us to provide a list of projects that we might be interested in. And the guidance was, don't send us, your maintenance projects, send us bigger projects. Think outside the box. Like if you had lots of money, what would you do? And so you might have seen that list in various, newspapers around the state. But some of those items on there were I-25, I-80 interchange in Cheyenne, reroute of I-80 around Elk Mountain so that we can avoid shutting down that highway so often during the year. That has a huge economic impact, on this nation, by the way. Doing something with the tunnels out there by Green River. A tunnel, we actually proposed one under Teton Pass to facilitate the commute there and to keep them out of, vehicles out of the avalanche danger zone, and fix the tunnels in the Wind River and those type of projects there. So what will happen with that? Don't know. What will happen with that bill? We don't know. But that was our, hey, think outside the box list that was submitted. Okay.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, what do we need to do to the Green River tunnels? Is that enlargement of them or not more of them, I guess, but.
Director?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, really, our ultimate wish would be to get rid of them so that we just take away the mountain there. And because they're a choke point. And right now, if you're an oversized load, for those of you here in Casper, you make those oversized boxes, they all go down the interstate. Right now, they go through the town of Green River to get around those tunnels. And so really, we'd just like to get rid of the tunnels and not have that obstacle out there anymore. Yeah. Okay, moving on to slide number 6 then. And this is my report back to you on where we're currently at on the tasks that you assigned YDOT during the last session. And so the first one had to do with, as you recall, House Bill 254, or the Transportation Computer System, otherwise known as RIS, is we are working to increase third-party fees as was directed. We are implementing the driver's license fee increases, and so those will all be ready to go 1 July. We have started meeting with YDOT and ETS. We've had several meetings with ETS. And actually, I talked to UW yesterday and have another call scheduled with them here in the near future to make sure they're in the loop. So we are, in our mind, taking the appropriate steps to proceed down the directed route. And we'll have an initial report to you in terms of timeline by the 1st of July. So right now, I think we're on timeline to meet the requirements on that bill. In terms of House Bill 14 or the issue of right-of-way access, we did send a letter to the governor for permission to proceed. So remember, that's the bill that requires us to ask the federal government for really unfettered access to the right-of-way, primarily for broadband, but because right now it just takes so long to get permits. So the governor said, yep, move out. And so we are in the process of actually standing up the initial work group, and actually Chairman reached out to Representative Somers on that one as he was really decisively engaged in the writing of that bill. So I think the meeting for that work group is scheduled for late in June. In terms,
So Director, with that one though, that the rights of way aren't going to be exclusively for broadband, correct? They'll include other utilities and other communication systems and maybe water lines or whatever.
Mr. Chairman, as I remember the bill and as our focus, it's primarily broadband, and it would not at this point include water and gas, because those things we really is the right of way is not a great place for those.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. In terms of driver's license requirements, we are working with the stakeholders on rulemaking, as we are with Game and Fish for on the roadkill bill. In terms of the large project funding, House Bill 66, the funding agreements are signed, and we'll let that project later this summer. And
Director, with that project, how much of that is coming out of the Wildlife Trust Fund, and how much is, say, general fund or coming out of your budget?
yeah, Mr. Chairman, most of that, the funding for that came from a build grant on the federal side, and I think it was about $14 million. There is the match for that, which is about, I believe, I want to say about 2.5 million, almost 3. Half of that came from Game and Fish Commission, and the other half came from the Transportation Commission.
Thank you.
You bet. Mr. Chairman, if we flip over to slide 7, there's a quick recap of where the construction will occur this construction season, which is underway. We have about 40 construction projects already in process, and more to come. So that's a good deal, and we'll make some headway there.
Senator Anderson. Senator?
Mr. Chairman, what are the different colors?
Director? Green. I don't see any blue.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Anderson, I was really debating because I'm sort of partially colorblind. So to the extent of exactly what those colors are, but they're very pretty. And I believe that those are really relative to the district that they belong to. And I'll have to get back with you on the rest, because I'm not sure exactly. This was a modified slide from a different one.
Director, I believe that on a monthly basis, you send all of us that construction report.
Okay, we do, yes, Mr.
Yes.
Yep. So, okay,
Continue.
moving on then to slide number 8, which is really our final slide. And I just really wanted to sort of end this quick update with how we started it, of some more pictures of your YDOT employees in action. So top left is an employee at the port of entry, making sure that 18-wheeler is safe and operational. To the one on the right There's a couple of our communication tower climbers, making sure that our comms are up and operational and maintained. And then in the bottom center, that is, we had 21 plow strikes this year. So which actually is a little bit down from last year. Well, last year, I think we had 28. It is, you know, it's more dangerous than you would think. So the guy driving this bottom plow, he's okay. His name's Ed. He was out of District 1. I called him the day after the wreck to make sure he was okay. He did have to go to the hospital and his back was hurt. But it was Valentine's Day when I talked to him. And he and his wife were sitting there at the house, you know, really celebrating the opportunity to be together that day. Because when I first saw that picture, I thought, oh man, we lost one. But he was plowing in the median, you know, really cleaning up after the storm, and he got hit hard from behind. And you know, it's actually a pretty clear day. I mean, you can see it's not cloudy, it's not snowing, and his plow dug in to the dirt, and his truck flipped end over end, and you can see the results. I think the sander probably was instrumental in saving his life, because that hit first and took the brunt. But anyway, that it's dedication of our employees. I'll tell you two things about our employees that I just sort of share with you today. One is we are under a lot of pressure in sort of the recruiting and retention phase of our employees. And I know you've heard it. And it does a lot of it boils down to just our compensation system. We now it is routine for new potential employees to turn down our job offer. So we just had one the other day. You know, I was out in the field and the guys were telling me about, you know, they offered a maintenance position. So that's a snowplow driver, a maintainer in Cheyenne. So we pay $17.31 an hour. And the number one, you know, candidate turned it down. The number two candidate turned it down. The number three candidate turned it down. And so the job is today not filled. And if there's a job that comes open, oftentimes, you know, other governmental agencies, entities will pay more than us. And for example, we had our foreman in one of our cities along Elk Mountain. A job came open in the county that was there, and you know, he was able to get a job at the county for $5 more an hour. He was off I-80, and he was a driver, not a foreman. And so I just share that with you as you know, as we look at staffing across the state. That's one of the issues we're dealing with. Sometimes people say, hey, you know, we'll make comments about, you know, the quality of our employees. And I tell you, what I share is, let me tell you about the YDOT that I know. Let me tell you about the employees that work at YDOT. And I like to talk about customer service, and I like to tell them about the survey results that we just got back, right? That don't happen by accident. I like to talk about the responsiveness of our employees. And if you're in a wreck, there's a Wyoming Highway Patrol trooper that's going to be there lickety split to help you out. I like to talk about the cost effectiveness of what we do, because across the board, we're making sure that we're cost effective. I like to talk about the dependability of your YDOT employees, and the over 12 million times that YDOT, you know, radios, you know, the push to talk button was pushed, and every time you got through to the other end. And that's the dependability of the system. And I like to talk about the innovation that our employees are doing, and new lights on our plows. We are really trying a lot of stuff to trying to reduce those snowplow hits, because it is frustrating to be hit, you know, from behind on those plows. And I really like to talk about and being a team player, and to what Chairman Burkhart talked about, our Chairman Landon on the southwest corner of the state, really working with really the town of Evanston now, trying to think outside the box on connecting trails, using right-of-way for our off-road vehicles, which is not a normal response because typically the response is, hey, no, we aren't going to let it. And we say, hey, how can we get to yes there? And that's the YDOT that I like to think about. And with that, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd stand for questions. That's a quick or not so quick sort of update on what we've got going.
Questions for the director, Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director. Could you briefly update us on the work that you're doing with the military department? Is that possible?
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Baker, I'm trying to think, what work are you talking about? A 130?
Yeah.
And a road?
Yeah.
I can update you on that. Still work in process that really started a couple weeks ago. But I think that's your time as liaison is where that came from with the Transportation Commission, certainly. But there's, the military's coming out of, a period of COVID, sort of reduction in training, and the Air Reserve, part of the Air Force actually called, probably 2 weeks ago and said, hey, listen, we're doing an exercise. It's has to do with, support in the Rockies at 20 to 30 aircraft. And one of the tasks we'd like to do is we'd like to land on a road. And Director, would you support that? So we, sort of looked at it. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with 130s from my past life. And, one of the interesting things there is if you're landing a 130 on a piece of asphalt, the minimum, width for an assault landing is 60 feet. And so, but we do have a stretch of road that's 64 feet wide, directly north of Rollins. And, come off the hill and it's a nice flat stretch and it's wide. So checked with the governor and he was, theoretically okay with that to start working some details. And so we are in the process of working through that and seeing if we can't make that a go. Our approach was, Wyoming is a military friendly state and the military needs to train somewhere. And as I talked to them about task and purpose of the exercise, really, it was to remind the world about the ability of the Air Force to project power and to be expeditionary in nature and to put aircraft down in areas where you might not, expect them to be. And so that's scheduled, if it goes, would be sometime between the 12th and 17th of September. Would certainly think that members of this committee would be interested in perhaps putting eyes on that. And we are working a robust public affairs plan, because to me, it is important to say, hey, here's what's going on and here's why, and not to keep it a secret. But thank you for that question, Representative Baker, because I think that's important.
Please.
So along those lines, I guess the only thing that I really have that might concern me about that is the touchdown point. I know that a lot of runways and that the touchdown point is the thickest part, I guess, of the runway. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but how would that impact the road? Sure.
Director. Mr. Chairman and Representative Baker. So good question. So that's certainly probably the very first chapter. Well, first you say, is it wide enough? Then you got to say, is it thick enough to absorb, the weight of that aircraft? So the short answer is yes, it's thick enough. So our engineers took a look at it. And then the second part of that will be the Air Force actually will come out and do what they will actually core it. And we'll give them permission to do that, because they will not land that aircraft there if it's not thick enough to support it. Because while we value our road, that aircraft's probably about $85 million. And so they want to make sure that that the road will support it. So I'm confident we'll get to the right area. They have not drilled yet, because really our request to them was that we have an agreement in place that the Air Force would help defray the costs associated with traffic control and repair of the road before we go too far.
Representative Brown, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions, if you don't mind. I'm going to take us back a step here in the ARPA funds as well as the CARES Act funds. And I'm just kind of curious, One of the discussions that came to me over the past couple of weeks has been, of course, thinking outside the box, has been the discussion of Next Gen 911 and whether or not Next Gen 911 has been a discussion point for the department and or anybody else that you guys may be specifically thinking about ETS with your discussions with ETS, whether or not Next Gen 911 has come up in discussions at all.
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Brown, Next Gen 911 has come up. In fact, Mr. Babbitt is the gubernatorially appointed, 911 coordinator for the state. And if you're okay with me inviting him up here, he could probably give you a more complete answer than me.
Okay. Mr. Babbitt, please, come on up. Identify yourself just so the people out there in virtual land know who you are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Troy Babbitt, I'm the Chief Technology Officer of WIDOT. So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, we have had discussions on 911. We have established working groups with local communities. Certainly taking a look at the appointment for me as the 911 coordinator was step one in the initial. Step two was to write a state plan. We're working with that with locals right now. We're getting close to having draft, but we're having continual conversations and getting to know all of the PSAPs, the public safety answering point locations across the state. So from a local level, we're building that trust and the groundwork and an awful lot of data collection right now. There was really no identification from a statewide perspective of what we even had on an inventory. Each location PSAP, who they would contact for backup calls, call routing, all of that type of things. So Wyoming is in its infancy right now. We're having all those conversations with ETS because it has the potential to get even larger depending on what databases or data sharing agreements could be a possibility. So a lot of work is being done at the groundwork. It will probably at some point take some state statute recommendations for change on some of those things. But if we have those two, a state coordinator and the state plan in place, it puts Wyoming in a position to be able to apply for any 911 federal grants that would come. And at that point, we would work with the committee to try and disperse those fairly and equitable across the PSAPs of who needs to get upgraded first, because it is a whole new world right now. That just to be a very simplistic, 911 is located on your address per se where it's at, but now with this next generation and the mobile phones, it's now going to be based on your location. Plus, it's high capacity broadband, so it's images, it's video, it's all that information that the public's going to start to demand on trying to find where somebody is located at 911.
Oh, Representative Brown, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a quick follow-up and maybe a little bit more of a statement, but I'll try to phrase it as a question as well. Do you guys notice when talking with the PSAPs that there's this underlying belief from the majority of Wyoming citizens that what they see in the movies and television, that when you dial 911, they know where you're at a regular basis. And what the truth is that that's the next gen 911 that we really do not have yet. Is that kind of the growing feeling that you get from most of the PSAPs throughout the state?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I would agree with that statement. Hollywood does promote those type of things. And I do think the next generation assumes that those are in place. A lot of times I'll have conversations with people as to, my kids can get hold of each other, but yet I can't dial 911 to have them know. Well, you've already submitted your information on a volunteer basis to some of these locations that you sign up with their app. 911 is a scenario where you're trying to work with the carriers, the citizens to voluntarily have that information, but we're all carrying a cell phone. So, there's some privacy agreements that have to be figured out there as well. So,
Senator Anderson.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do remember what I was going to ask. The C-130s landing on a road north of Medicine Bow, are those just touch and goes, or are they actually stopping, turning around, and taking off?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, it would be land and then potentially unload some people because they want to land, to your question, as light as possible. They will not turn off the engines. Depending on how much road they've used, they'll either take off or they'll back up and then take off. They will not turn on the road because of the stress that causes to the asphalt. So there'll be no turning movement.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go to the snowplows really quick, and I think this one might actually involve Colonel Holler. I'm going to express frankly, some disgust with the fact that we continuously have this discussion about snowplows being hit. It's nothing you guys are doing. It's frankly the people that aren't paying attention that injure our state workers that are doing this, and it just infuriates me. What is our current bond? If somebody hits a snowplow and causes this, is that bond issued solely to the driver? Does it hit the company? What type of penalty are we talking about? Because it doesn't seem to be enough to stop this ridiculous amount of people hitting our snowplows and injuring our workers.
Director, do you want? Colonel
Mr. Chairman,
Howard
I
to-
would ask that Colonel Heller be allowed to come forward.
Colonel Howard, please identify yourself for the people out there watching on PBS.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Kevin Haller, Colonel of the Wyoming Highway Patrol. Representative Landon Brown, it depends. I was getting there. It could be a number of citations. There could be reckless driving, careless driving, following too close, failure to yield. So I do agree with your sentiment. There is far too many of these occurring, and oftentimes it's already the worst of conditions out there. And that's why our snowplows are on the roadway, right? And so if most of us in Wyoming have been behind these large units, and visibility does become a safety issue and a hindrance. So we have been looking at the higher penalties whenever we believe that it warrants that, such as careless driving or reckless driving. And in response to your question, if it is a commercial vehicle, it will affect that CDL and the safety score. If it is not a commercial vehicle, then it will go against that individual's driver's license, generally a Class C.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, I really appreciate Representative Brown bringing this up because I feel the same way he does. I'm just curious if I smack into the back of one of our snowplow drivers, does my insurance, are you able to collect that at the department level? Do you get anything in return from some of this? Is my insurance company going to send you a check for $250,000 for that snowplow?
Director, I think you're anxious to answer that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, the short answer is yes, we pursue that as part of the accident and damage recovery is what we call it. So it really right now certainly goes through risk management at the state level, and they'll work with us to replace the unit. What I tell you that we actually just signed a contract here within the month with an outside entity to assist us to do better in this concept of damage recovery. And so it's a third party vendor, and that's what they do. So we turn over the accident information to them, and they aggressively pursue the insurance company of whoever is involved. You know, other examples would be you have a semi that hits a bridge and does damage to the bridge. Okay, we need to collect that. We have a semi that runs through a guardrail, and we have to replace guardrail. So all of that we're interested in recovering. And so it was one of the areas we thought we could do better in being more cost effective. And so while we had an internal office that did it, you know, we didn't think we were getting enough. And so we said, hey, how can we do this better? And so we have contract with an outside vendor. So they get a percentage of what they take, and we think we'll do
Chairman,
significantly better.
the general manager of that
Continue.
company, his name's Guido. He's a really big guy. Anyway, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Director, Colonel Haller, both of you, you know, maybe for our next meeting, if you have some additional ideas on how to prevent the accidents to start with. I know you're kind of at wit's end also. On this.
Mr. Chairman, I'll tell you one thing we are trying, and we've authorized is we're gonna go with, I think, a green,
Yeah, wider green.
wider. We're gonna try and change the color of the lights on the back of that, the plows and see if that helps. But because you're right, it's just like, we've tried different colors. We put signs up on the DMS, snow plows ahead, but it's just, and for the drivers, it's sort of a scary deal when you see pictures like, what happened to Ed. And you never know, when that'll happen. So, but anyway, but thank you.
Senator Anderson?
Mr. Chairman, the truck and all that and the insurance paying off for that's one thing. It's wonderful. You get compensated for that. I'm a little more worried about the operator. And the operator, I think, falls under the workers' comp laws and has got compensated that way, or his expenses are paid, which is badly lacking for the long-term injury guy. Are we doing anything with that? And then the second part of that is, I see on a lot of your vehicles, you have an absorption type device that trails along behind. Is that not an option for the snow plows? They can't carry one of those?
Director?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, so in terms of workers' comp, I'd really probably prefer to turn that question over to Mr. Rossetti, who's here with your permission on that. In terms of the attenuators, which we do run on, specifically on the interstates, is I asked that same question, but based on sort of how all the back of the sander comes out, really what the guys told me is that it just wouldn't work. I did think about putting a vehicle with an attenuator behind every plow, but then that doubles the requirement for operators, and quite frankly, we don't have enough, and we couldn't plow enough road if we did that, because we got to have the drivers in seats, and so it doubles the number of people we need. So that was really the issue there. I'll tell you, on the attenuator, they work. We just had a strikeout on I-80 last week. In fact, on Friday, and it was one of our paint crews. So we had the painter, and they run 14 miles an hour. And there's the big signs on the big flasher, and then there's a vehicle behind it with the attenuator. And we did have a vehicle just run right in the back of the attenuator. We think it saved that driver's life because it did collapse like it was supposed to. The crew in the vehicle in the 8-yard with the attenuator on was fine. And so we know that technology works, and we think it saved a life on Friday. But again, was it somebody, it's a clear day, it was well marked, lots of flashing lights, and whether it's distracted driving or, I haven't heard the debrief on that one yet, but that's where my mind goes is, what causes you to just drive full speed into the back of a truck like that? It's just got to be not paying attention.
Mr. Rossetti, if you'd identify yourself, and then you can talk about workers' comp.
Mr. Chairman, Taylor Rossetti, Support Services Administrator for WYDOT. In response to Senator Anderson's question, yes, we do participate in workers' compensation. And as you mentioned, the long-term, I guess, liability or injury or loss for that individual certainly may not be accounted for fully in that process. We do participate in the process to the full extent. One of the other things that we do try to do as well is try to work towards some like limited duty, light duty type things to try to get people back to the workforce earlier. I think there's an awful lot of discussion that says if you can get people back into the workforce, even if it's not at full capacity, there's advantages to both the employee and the system as a whole. So we do work that where it makes some sense. As far as the overall benefit for workers' comp, it would be outside of my scope personally, but we would certainly be interested in working with anybody to try to make that process work better.
All right. Any other questions for the director and his team?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a sort of a general comment, and I'll try to build it into a question, but Director, I think there's a lot of interest on our committee to do whatever we can to look for leverage points that we might be able to take into that potential special session in July. You indicated a couple of points of reference, the 3.5 million figure that was thrown out there. I have a particular interest in WildLink, for example, that maybe there's some pieces of that. I'd be curious to know any reactions you or Mr. Babbitt, others might have with regard to that storm in March, for example. Did we run into things that would point us toward the ability to draft up something for consideration in July? I don't think necessarily that the governor's office has identified much on our transportation front. Is that because there just isn't any place that we can secure any of that funding, or what are your thoughts on that front? We've carved out a day in June, for example, that we would really like to work on a couple of pieces to take into July that might benefit our transportation or communication system.
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think specifically on that regard, in terms of WildLink, we do think that there would be a nexus to the rescue funds, specifically in the area of safety, because the WildLink directly affects, the safety on our roads and really everywhere else, because really all response agencies pretty much across the state use it. It's our state emergency safety communication system. And to that effect, I know that there was a proposal to fund ongoing issues with WildLink, and that would be in terms of Quantars, which is the radio replacement, in terms of power supply, in terms of ongoing maintenance agreements, in terms of potentially new towers. And actually the list became fairly long. Our recommendation and priority was the top 5. And if you wanted to go over that in detail in June, we would be fully prepared to do that. The other area that jumps up as a potential area would be a RIS, and to see if we couldn't leverage some of the rescue money into that transportation system.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
I really appreciate those thoughts, Director. I think you hit a couple of buttons that we want to try to push. The issue with I think the June time that we've kind of carved out tentatively is that we would put the finishing touches on any sort of bill that we could take into that special session. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure at the end of things here how you want to handle it, but I would suggest that maybe we could visit about that and send forward a request with our staff to maybe get something drafted up regarding this conversation right here. That way, when we come back in June, we can put the frosting on the cake instead of trying to bake the cake right before we go to July. I hope that makes sense.
I think, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think so. I think that's, what we've been asked to do, and would have a bill probably for, one bill for military department on those issues we talked about, and then combine everything we've just talked about for WYDOT into another bill. I'm pretty sure that any special session is going to be limited to budget kind of issues and no other legislation. So for staff, do you have that concept?
Not exactly. I may want to make sure that all of the things that we have, and that's something to address WildLink funding as well as the
I think you have it, what we've asked for. It'd be for the, and I'm not sure what the special session would look like. I know we're going to consider returning CARES 1 Act money. We'll get some money back from that. And then also the ARPA money. And I think, the RIS system, I believe we'd looked at CARES 1 money. It's coming back for that. And I'm not sure if management wants bills or wants us to coordinate requests with appropriations. And that's something we'll probably, the chairman and I will probably have to figure that out and get back to you. But I think you have the concept down. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just Heather, also, if I could ask that you include local governments in whatever we would consider to draft up, that piece of what the director just, I think you alluded to the fact that we're talking about equipment needs, which if we don't keep our entities on the system, we don't have a safety system. So my thought is, not just the state towers and the state costs, but I'm interested in our local governments, and maybe there's a way we could leverage some help for county governments and for our municipalities to upgrade their equipment to the extent that we can stay on a system like that. So I hope that makes sense.
Mr. Chairman, I think that might be specifically guidance that is right for this bill, because the bit of federal guidance that has come out that I've reviewed so far, because it just came out, I believe, on the 10th of May, it indicates that local funds will go to a state to distribute. So then it sounds like, if I'm hearing it correctly, that the request would be in this kind of omnibus YDOT bill to include a directive to the state to take state monies to also go to the local entities.
Okay, thank you for that.
Director, you had something to add.
Mr. Chairman, if I could recommend or ask that you also include in that concept the funding for the capacity purchase agreement, which is really a transportation related issue to me in terms of putting, bodies in seats on our aircraft and making sure that we keep air service to those communities, because in my mind, it's so critically important, economically to our state to keep those airplanes flying.
Thank you. Thank you, Director. Heather, would you include that? And I think, Director, how much, 14 million sticks in my mind on the capacity purchase agreement
Mr.
as a
Chairman, it
loss.
was about 13.4, so your memory is good.
Okay. So to recoup some of that on the capacity purchase for the airports.
Absolutely.
And I thought, my understanding was that was almost a definite that does fit into the ARPA money.
Mr. Chairman, the way we calculated that, we think it fits directly. And that was really, that was the delta between what we thought we would pay in a non-COVID environment to what we think we'll pay in a COVID and post-COVID environment. So that we tried to really calculate, because it's a best guess, but we really tried to calculate what the effects of COVID would be this year. And then because the ARPA funding is for 4 years, over the next 4 years to project it. And the other item with that amount is it does include the local match, because we thought it was important to take a comprehensive look at that, more than just the state dollars. But to your point about, hey, let's include locals in there. And so we tackle it all together.
Okay. Heather, are you clear on that, what we just did? Okay, thank you. So I think that wraps it up. I'm going to deviate a little bit, although this was just more of a general update. We did some other work. So with that, I'll open it up to public comment. Anybody in the room wish to comment on any of the things we just did? Okay, anybody on Zoom? Okay, nope. All right, with that, I'll close public comment. So the next item for us is a report from DI Management, the independent needs assessment that was done. Director, you should have just stayed there. So do we have DI Management here, or are they going to participate virtually?
Mr. Chairman, DI Management will participate virtually. So they
Okay.
should be up on the Zoom. And I would ask for permission to just make a couple comments
Please.
about what you're going to see. So just for you, for the committee, I've been here for about 2 years in this position, and enjoy it a lot. One of the questions that I had as I came on board is, what's the real need? Because I think it's always better if you make decisions based on facts, and that we know specifically what our funding requirements are and what funding gaps are. And so my request, and it was probably over a year ago because this study took a while, was to a competent, independent, outside third party to take a look at WYDOT and take a look at our processes and to take a look at our funding requirements and really give a third party almost audit-like view of where our shortages are. And that's what they initially presented to this committee last November and what they're prepared to report back again on today. But that's really the nexus. It was our request based on really just wanting to know the facts as we go down the road. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Director. So Amanda, whoever we have with dye management, if you want to let them in the room or to the screen or whatever we call it. I'm sorry, Amanda, what was that? Okay. All right. If when you speak for the first time, if you would identify yourselves for the record and for those people watching outside of the room. So with that, I'll open it up. Who do we have from dye management?
Good afternoon. This is Rob Zalay. I'm president of Dye Management Group. And with me today is Jeff Hollabaugh, senior manager at Dye Management.
Good afternoon.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Just making sure everybody can hear us okay and that you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we'll get started here with the agenda. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to present to the committee today. We'll talk about introduction to the firm, the scope of our project, which was an annual needs assessment or unfunded needs assessment for WYDOT. Talk about the quantification and how we did that assessment, the details there, and then also a short amount of results from our focus group findings, as well as our observations, and then we'll open this up to questions. However, we do have we have time at the end for questions, but we'd certainly ask that if you have a specific question during the presentation that you just let us know.
Okay, proceed.
Okay, so a little bit about Dye Management. We're a transportation-focused management consulting firm based in Seattle. We've been in business for a little over 30 years, and we do a lot of these types of assessments, these needs analyses. To date, over those 30 years, we've done about 400 of these for 31 different state and transportation agencies. That includes projects specifically for transportation departments, which is about 90% of our work, and also to legislative committees. And one of the things that we focus on is teaming with experts and applying industry best practices. So on this project, for this analysis, we worked with Kinley Horn and also with Math Tech, who had previously been doing some work with WYDOT on the RIS project, both of which supplemented our expertise and really helped us get down to the numbers we're going to talk about today. We are, as I mentioned, we've worked with 31 state agencies. We do have staff locations throughout the country, including one not too far of a ride up down from Cheyenne there, Jeff, in Denver. Okay, so we'll just jump right into this here. So the focus of the project was to determine the unfunded annual need for WYDOT, and that was based on 9 major needs areas that you're seeing here in front of you. Obviously, some of these are larger areas, needs areas than others, and surface transportation is typically one of the biggest as far as numbers go. So we've broken these down within these bolded categories to subcategories and broken out the needs within those individually. So for years, WYDOT had noted an unfunded need of $136 million. I know at least for the last 4 to 5 years, that was a number that was thrown around. But as you can see here, the total need is closer to $350 million. So there was a substantial gap there where even it was almost or just over $120 million just on surface transportation projects. So when we talk about that $136 million estimate, that was really more reflective of just surface transportation. So despite a conservative and fiscally prudent approach with existing funds, taking care of what YDOT owns, there just wasn't enough money to address the need of the transportation system and then the other needs that we're showing here to keep it up to the levels that the traveling public and the folks in Wyoming expect. So what we did with our assessment was really dive into more of detail, an additional level of detail and precision for quantifying these needs. And we're going to talk about each of these needs areas here briefly on the next few slides. Okay, so the first one, obviously one of the largest or the largest of all, is surface transportation and pavement and preservation and construction. So the estimated need is $236.7 million over the 10 years. Now that's based on a average need over those years, with 160 million of that funded annually, leaving 76.7 million unfunded. So a couple quick notes here. As Director Reiner mentioned, this project was complete at the end of last year in the October-November timeframe. We did present to the JTC at that time as well. And we appreciate Director Reiner and his team's willingness to be available throughout this project. We couldn't have done this type of analysis without the data and the team members that helped us do this. And it's not just the team members, but it's also the practices. YDOT has substantial best practices in place that support the analysis. So we come in as an independent consultant to do this, but we rely on accurate and precise data, which YDOT was able to provide. So we'll talk a little bit about what this unfunded need is. There was really a focus on maintaining the system, the pavement system, in its 2017 state of performance. Wyoming's Transportation Asset Management Plan, or their TAMP, used the 2017 level as a baseline as representing an overall good pavement network with minimal poor pavement. And the way they do this is through a PSR, pavement serviceability rating, or PSR, where a 3.5 or greater is good, and basically anything under 2.5 is poor. And what you really try to focus on is maintaining, as we've shown here, a good blend of interstate, NHS, non-NHS routes in a good or fair condition, and minimizing the amount of poor pavement that's out there. So obviously there's a substantial gap here, as I noted. We're looking at $76.7 million per year unfunded on the pavement side. And what this really translates to is an increased cost to the taxpayers, where it becomes more costly to maintain or to do substantial rehabilitation on the pavement the longer it's in a fair or poor condition. And of course, this can also negatively impact traveler safety and reduce the level of service for the traveling public by making it a rougher ride and a potential damage to vehicles. Any questions on that one? We'll jump ahead here.
Any question? Mr.
Yes.
Zalay, one question. How do you calculate what is unfunded?
So we look at, good question. That's what, Mr. Chairman, was that from you?
Yes.
Okay, appreciate the question. So we look at the funding levels that they've historically used at YDOT, and what they've requested and what they've applied to the payment system is $160 million. So we're using that as a baseline, and then noting that out of that amount, 236 is the actual need. So what we're showing here is that over the next 10 years, they would be putting $160 million into this program, but the need is actually 236.7, which leaves 76.7 unfunded.
Okay.
And of course,
thank you.
That varies from year to year.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead and proceed.
You're welcome. So we want to show what the difference is here of what the impact will be. So YDOT manages about just short of 7,000 miles of highway. And what we're showing is if the current spending level of $160 million is maintained, by the year 2030, 42% of the network will be in a poor condition. So what that translates to is about 3,000 miles of bad highways statewide if the funding level is not increased to the 236 million that's shown here, which of course would maintain it steadily at that 2017 level of right around 16%. in poor condition. So the other major spend area, of course, is on the, and by the way, when we look at bridge and we look at pavement, that constitutes the construction area of surface transportation. So we break out routine maintenance and some of the other traffic and safety projects. These are just focused on construction and rehabilitation, major preservation and replacement type projects. I just wanted to clarify that. So we have a total need on the bridge preservation side and replacement side of $62 million, 35 million of which is funded, leaving $27 million per year unfunded. And this was developed for fiscal year 21 by looking at the replacement bridges that are past their design service life over the next 20 years, which translates to $50.5 million in replacement bridges. And then also looking at maintaining 92% of all bridge deck, which is considered a best practice, in good or fair condition at $11.5 million per year. So that's how we came up with the $62 million. And we show that historically, this program has been funded at around $35 million per year, leaving that $27 million gap. So again, the effects of underfunding here, increased taxpayer, and you'll hear this song quite a few times as we talk here. It becomes more costly to replace rather than to rehabilitate any type of asset. So it increases the cost of the taxpayers due to increased life cycle costs. Also can result in bridge weight postings, which negatively impact freight and other heavy truck traffic. I think a good example that Director Reiner mentioned in one of our earlier presentations is ranchers may need to use 2 trucks to haul cattle instead of 1 once these are posted. And that doesn't just result in additional traffic, but also an additional cost on those ranchers. And then there's also a potential risk of not meeting the FHWA requirement of no more than 10% poor bridges on the NHS, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And you'll see here that in 10 years, if the current funding level is maintained, 187 additional bridges will be beyond their service life, which could translate to being past the 10% requirement by FHWA. And 187 is actually right around 10% of the total bridge inventory. Any questions on bridge?
Senator Anderson.
Here you go. No.
That's getting to be debatable.
I may not know it, but
Oh,
the
you
general
do
knows
know
it.
the trick.
General knows it. Let's see. The ranchers need to use 2 trucks to haul cattle instead of 1. As we are privy to do, we usually give a ag exemption there, and we let them load up 1 truck all they wanted to run that. So I'm not worried about the ranchers.
Understood.
Okay.
All right, we'll jump ahead to
Mr.
highway
Zil-
maintenance. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Zalay, please continue.
Will do. So we'll talk a little bit about surface transportation and the highway maintenance. So obviously this is non-rehabilitation or preservation type activities. This is just your routine maintenance that the workers, that the crews are doing daily. The total estimated need is 98.3 million, and 88.4 million of that is funded. So over 10 years, we're looking at only an unfunded need of 9.9 million, or just under $1 million per year. We looked at this using the level of service approach that WYDOT has implemented, where they go out and look at their performance of the assets, the maintainable assets. They look at the quantity that they have, and then determine what the cost is to achieve these targets. And you can see here on their 2019 balanced scorecard, the red areas are the ones where they missed targets. So the additional funds that we're talking about, or about the 1 million per year, is what will be necessary to address these, like 80.2% of concrete segments, 93.8% of asphalt road surfaces that are deficient, trying to achieve the 90% and the 95%. Another example, of course, is the guardrail, where you have a target of 85% of the segments that need to be maintained, but that is actually higher than the 85% target. So there is, and we did account for spreading out some of these overachieving categories to address the underachieving, but the need is still about $1 million per year. And the impact of underfunding this, I know we've given a couple examples here of road surface, shoulders and approaches and drainage, but this also decreases the ability for snow and ice operations. Also, it could result in poor condition of right-of-way fence, roadway delineation and markings with negative impacts on traveler safety. So when you think about maintainable assets or highway assets that are not specific to the pavement surface or to bridges, it's everything else that you see out there. It's your shoulders, your barriers, your guardrails, your signs. And these are things that need to be addressed in order to maintain that level of service that increases or maintains the safety level.
Representative Stiver, did you have a question?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, on this fence through the chairman, on the fence replacement, why are we replacing fence and fence posts now that are still in good shape?
Well, a good question, Senator. The YDOT would not replace anything that is still functioning as intended. When we talk about routine maintenance, it's either due to a non-performing asset or to, in some cases, like with guardrail and possibly fence, it's also about crashes. So what they do when they look at right-of-way fence or roadway delineation or any of these assets, they go out and look at a statistically significant sample of the roadway, and they assess what percent of those assets are not performing as needed. So on right-of-way fence, it could be across 1/10 of a mile or 528 feet. There might be 20 or 30 feet in a certain section that's down that needs to be replaced. And that's what they would focus on only. They wouldn't be focusing on replacing anything that's functioning as intended.
Follow up. This was for the director. There's traveling here the other day, I was watching them put miles of fence in, new poles, new wire. Looking at the wire that was rolled up was still good. Just doesn't make sense why we're out there replacing stuff that's still functional.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Stiver, I'm going to need to get back to you on that one. I certainly, we have responsibility, from fence line to fence line. But I'll need to get back to you on that specific question.
Are we good to continue with traffic? Oh, I can't hear, sorry.
Please continue, Mr. Zalay, that maybe the chairman's microphone is not operating.
Yeah, I'm hearing that, but I wasn't hearing the side conversations. I apologize. Okay, we'll jump over to surface transportation traffic projects. This is relatively lower number compared to the ones we've talked about, but we have an estimated total need of 25.1 million and 19.4 of that is funded, leaving just short of 6 million unfunded. Now there's a lot of examples and the full report gives the full list of these, but basically these are traffic specific projects that are currently unfunded. And some examples here are installing variable speed limit dynamic messaging systems on I-80, grooving I-80, pavement to increase the life of pavement markings, installing backup power systems at tunnels. And they also include several ITS projects as well that will address connected and autonomous vehicles and assets. I seem to have lost the screen, Jeff. So the impacts of underfunding these, of course, traffic-related assets increases the likelihood that drivers will encounter non-functioning traffic signal signs, roadway striping, and delineation. which of course can lead to avoidable increase in vehicle crashes, property damage, injuries, and fatalities.
Okay, questions? Please continue.
Okay. I
Rob, is
apologize.
it
I'm not
back?
seeing the screen here.
Is it still not back? I apologize. Seems like I've dropped my Wi-Fi, but it's showing me connected, but
We aren't seeing the presentation.
Hey, gents, they do have a hard copy, so why don't you just proceed?
Okay, we'll do.
Just
when it
talk
comes
about
back
what
up.
slide you're on.
Very good. So we'll talk about on the safety side. This year is also because safety is so critical. Historically, most of these projects are funded just short of $1 million in unfunded need here. So we looked at the gap between the 20 million year needs quantification from the safety management system and then the 19.1 million that's currently funded in the STIP. Now this includes, when you look at the list of projects that's included there that are funded, you have safety related projects like shoulder widening, guardrail installation or enhancement, and roadway elevation modification. So these are very specific to safety, avoidance of crashes and safety related projects. So I think there was one interesting take on this, that fatal and serious, the quote that we got out of the TRIP fact sheet was that fatal and serious motor vehicle crashes in which the lack of adequate roadway safety features was likely a contributing factor cost Wyoming of $217 million per year in medical, lost productivity, travel delays, workplace costs, insurance, and legal costs. So we see that there is, historically, that's why these are funded. These things directly relate to a substantial savings to the taxpayers and to the state. So that, as we noted here, though, the gap is relatively small to address some of these additional unfunded projects in the STIP.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Zelay, I missed your reference to the amount that it's costing our constituents. You 200 and some million. Can you go back over that real quickly?
I could, certainly. So the 2020 April TRIP fact sheet that was pulled down off of the trip.org website, I believe it was presented in April of last year, if not to the Joint Committee, but to others at WYDOT and leadership. It says basically that fatal and serious motor vehicle crashes that were the result of inadequate roadway safety features was likely a contributing factor costing Wyoming Motors $217 million per year. And that study showed that that was related to medical costs, lost productivity, travel delays, workplace costs, and insurance and legal costs total. I do have a reference or a link to that I can forward to the members.
Thank you for that. I think that would be of interest just to make sure we have it in our back pocket. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for the question. I also want to note that using the safety management system and the projects that were identified for this, 20 million per year seems to be the amount of safety projects where the benefit tends to flatten out. So if you look at the list of projects that are out there that are safety related over the next 10 years, the relationship of that spending to the actual reduction in crashes becomes asymptotic. So we don't see simply spending double this will not have the amount of crashes. At some point, it just becomes more spend doesn't really affect them. And 20 million seems to be, based on our analysis and work with the safety system and the folks on that side, that 20 million is where that's the most bang for the buck on these projects.
Okay.
Okay, then we have projects identified for future expansion. So this one was pretty easy to identify the unfunded need. Basically, every project that was listed here was noted as being unfunded, but we felt it was necessary to call out what some of these projects were. So worked with Wyoming DOT or WYDOT to identify the 2-lane roads that are currently exceeding capacity and will require additional future travel lanes. With an average of 3.5 million per mile for that expansion, and an annual average of about $100 million in capacity projects over the next 10 years. So the 12 projects that we show here on this slide are specific projects that were in that list. that comprise the $100 million or $10 million per year, including the US 16 capacity expansion in Buffalo, the I-80 service road in Rock Springs, and then the I-80 business loop and I-80 business loop US 30 in Laramie and Green River. So what
Mr. Zalay,
yes, sir.
a question on those. How was the exceeding capacity calculated?
Good question, Mr. Chairman. So the WYDOT anticipates that Wyoming is going to continue seeing fringe growth around the cities and towns. And they look at the capacity of the roads in those areas where that growth is expected and look at the average daily traffic that exists there now, or annualized average daily traffic that exists there now, and what the road was designed for. So basically, based on projections, they are able to predict the areas where these projects would address that kind of growth.
Okay, Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there anywhere in the report that identifies capacity issues on the interstate?
Mr. Zalay?
Good question, sir. So we did it from a perspective of the unfunded need. So it was the purpose of the scope of the project was not to look at the engineering capacity of this, but I do believe that WYDOT has that information internally as part of their analysis. So what we identified working with WYDOT, the locations that would provide the most benefit based on their projections, but they had already done the analysis internally to identify where those projects would be. And Director Reiner, I don't know if that's something that we might be able to provide them internally from WYDOT, the results of that analysis from your folks internally.
Director?
Mr. Chairman, we can sure do that. Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Zalay, one of you, just, if I'm not mistaken, because I think I've seen it, I may have a copy of it, not here. The entire complete report was about 500 pages, wasn't it? Or something close to that.
I hope not.
Okay.
Well, with appendices, it might have pushed 200. I believe we were pushing about 100 in the final report, though.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So definitely not readable in one evening, but certainly not 500. And let me just say one quick follow-up to this. Mobility metrics aren't typically a big issue for Wyoming, but you have to look at expanding mobility and capacity when you're looking at creating alternative routes for connecting communities. We've done similar work in states, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Texas, where a lot of times there's only one way to get there from here. And when you're looking at expansion of these routes, it's not only just because it can possibly create an alternate route between these communities, but if one of these routes is shut down due to avalanche, due to a slide, whatever it may be, it provides an alternative that can handle double duty of that traffic that used to be spread out over multiple routes. So I think that's another key point that was used in the analysis here.
Okay.
Looks like we're sharing here internally now, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
And you are here in the room also.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Obviously the main point here is, and I think I just spoke to this, but increased delays resulting in longer travel times, despite mobility not being a key metric that WYDOT typically focuses on unless it's just in certain areas. And then, of course, increased drive time results in negative impacts on individual and commercial carrier costs and the economic vitality. So here again, we want folks to be able to travel in the fastest, safest way possible between 2 points. And if expansion is necessary to allow that, then that's why these projects were identified.
Okay.
All right, so we'll jump ahead quickly to, I think this is the second to last part of surface transportation. We looked at no unfunded need in this area, so we won't spend a lot of time here. But on the ITS, Intelligent Transportation System, and Road Weather Information System, these were needs that were identified by the WYDOT team that worked in this area, validated by our team with our subject matter experts on our partner teams. And obviously this is critical during the winter season, snow and ice season, of using ITS and RWIS to identify key areas that need to be focused on during snow and ice removal. All right, so I lied. There are two left. The next will be wildlife crossings. So this is an area that's currently not funded, but I wanted to address this, that we worked collaboratively, or I should say YDOT worked collaboratively with several public agencies and nonprofits to develop a priority list of locations for wildlife crossings. That included the Game and Fish Department, Bureau of Land Management, Migration Initiative, and Wildlife Federation of Nature Conservancy. So what they did was look at a list of projects basically over the next 10 years and looking at about one project per year over that amount of time. We're looking at $22.4 million need per year. Now, of course, this is when we're talking about guardrail and ITS and snow and ice removal, topics like this or areas like this can be made lower priority, but keep in mind that these do lower the incidence of avoidable vehicle and animal collisions, which can result in injuries, loss, and loss of life and vehicle damage. And I always refer back to some of our work we did in Montana on the safety side about 10 years ago, where at the time their largest amount or the greatest amount of fatalities occurred not from vehicle crashes, but vehicle, non-vehicle, and vehicle wildlife crashes. So there is these projects do show that they do minimize those collisions and loss of life, not just for, of course, the wildlife, but for the drivers of the vehicles.
Mr. Zlay, hold with us just a moment, please. I have a question for the director.
Yes.
So, Director, why do you think YDOT keeps getting, I don't want to say stuck, but assigned these wildlife crossings, when to me it's more of an issue with Game and Fish, NGOs and that group, rather than putting all this? It seems like all of this gets put on the department when it's should be put with other agencies. Just an opinion, Director, that's all.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we've worked closely with the Game and Fish and with the NGOs and the development of the list. In the end, the money flows through us wherever it comes from to do that project. And so I think for the state, it's probably captured in, because it's associated with horizontal transportation, it's captured here for the state.
All right,
regardless of funding source.
So I guess, Director, it makes it safer. I remember the days in the state when most of the roads were not fenced. And that was a big deal, was to fence the right of way. And now it seems to be a big deal to put these crossings in, whether they're under the road or over the road. Don't you think?
Mr. Chairman, we do think. I'll tell you what I always do share is it's a safety issue. It is more of a safety issue for animals than for people. We kill a lot of animals. We do not kill a lot of people. The last count, I think, over the last 10 years was about 5 people killed with wildlife strikes. Most of them were on a motorcycle. But it certainly prevents lots of damage to vehicles.
All right. Thank you, Director, even though we can now make use of those dead animals. So please, Mr. Zalay, please continue.
Will do. All right, last in the service transportation is delayed STIP projects. So these were projects that since the last STIP, were the update to the STIP, these were projects that were identified that were not started or delayed because of lack of funding. And there's a total of just under $436 million in projects in the STIP that have not been funded, including reconstruction, widening, passing lane additions, and new construction that's listed on this slide. So basically at this point, because it was delayed due to being unfunded, it becomes a completely unfunded component of this analysis. And looking over the next 10 years, that translates to 43.6 million that will be needed to address these delayed STIP projects, in addition to starting the projects that were identified for fiscal year 21 and beyond. I don't know if any of these translate to green or pink or orange dots or not, but certainly some of these areas look pretty similar to the maps that were shown earlier. But again, we look at impacts of underfunding. These are substantial STIP, substantial transportation projects that impact the economy Wyoming due to loss of construction-related jobs, impact on pavement performance and overall level of service. And then, of course, we go back to that increased drive time, which increases costs and decreases economic vitality. So that was the biggest chunk of what we needed to go through. We're more than halfway through these now, thankfully. But obviously, surface transportation is one of the biggest components of any DOT budget. But that doesn't, undervalue some of these other areas and the critical impact that they have on other areas, including, the ones that we're going to talk about now, computer systems being the first. So basically, we looked at, for this analysis, we looked at the budget for IT, looked at what was included in that budget, and then working through personnel and business unit leads within the IT group. We looked at unfunded needs or undocumented needs, which included upgrades and enhancements to existing systems, procurement of those systems, annual license fees that hadn't been addressed earlier, and additional 5 FTEs. One thing that was unique during this project, though, was the telework environment. And I know we had some anecdotal discussion or evidence about how the impact of everybody working from home, or at least 50% of folks working from home in any given week, really impacted the infrastructure and the ability for the telework environment. And of course, that became more important and required more focus. So while we were working on this, we were keeping an eye on that situation, of course, addressing, showing or demonstrating at least the importance of having that infrastructure up to speed. So when something like this occurs, you're not seeing that kind of slowdown or issues that might have been realized those first couple of weeks. Beyond that, though, there's, of course, the vulnerability to cyber attacks, downtime of critical software, decreased productivity that goes along with that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the decreased ability to support mobile YDOT field operations and the telework. And it's important to separate telework versus field operations. When we look at modern technology, the ability to track work, to track using AVL and GPS on equipment, and how that relays back to the main system, and it's updatable on iPads or tablets and phones for all the work crews, that requires infrastructure. And that's one of the things that we addressed with the CIO and the IT group here, making sure that that type of backbone would be available for future enhancements to the systems.
So, Mr. Zalay, this is everything other than the risk system, correct?
Absolutely correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that one gets a topic all of its own, right? Kind of teeing up on the, after teeing up the computer systems, communications comes next. Now, during our assessment, we had originally had this as a $5.5 million need that was completely unfunded, but in September, toward the end of our project, WYDOT did come to an agreement with Motorola for funding. So wireless capital operating needs of the physical infrastructure will be met for the next biennium based on that. However, that did not address the need of the radio replacement for the WYDOT maintenance crews, which is $800,000. They are using antiquated systems. There's inability to get parts, and they're kind of they're using or skeletonizing the parts from broken ones to try to fix things that are already past their useful life. So that remains the only unfunded portion in communications.
Mr. Zalay, a question on that, and I think I misunderstood what you said. And looking at this, originally there was a $5.5 million amount that you said was unfunded, and then you said an agreement was reached with Motorola that caused it to be $4.7 million funded. So is Motorola giving the department 4.7 million? I'm unclear on that. If you would explain that, please.
That's a good question that I might direct. I believe, Director Reiner, you still have your staff in there. They might be able to answer this a little more thoroughly. What we learned was that it was not funded when we began our project, and toward the end of our project, we learned that it was now funded. So that's just how we documented it.
Mr. Babbitt, you're back. So if you can answer that, please.
Mr. Chairman, if I can, this was the unfunded amount for the radio needs for the maintenance side of the fence only, not specifically for infrastructure. Again, WiLink's a complex animal in itself. You get the infrastructure, you get the maintenance agreement, and you get the endpoint radius.
So how did we get $4.7 million in funding?
Mr. Chairman, I believe those amounts would have come off the road to fund those amounts.
I mean, Mr. Chairman, we took it from existing resources.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead if you would, sir.
Okay. Mr. Zalay, please continue. Sorry, we're having some computer problems, communication problems.
No worries. Okay, we'll talk about the Highway Patrol now. What we did with Highway Patrol was looked at the ongoing list that Colonel Haller and others at WHP worked with us on to document specifically unfunded needs. Historically, their budget has been met, but there were certain things that were needed that weren't necessarily part of that ongoing budget request or that annual budget request. So working with them, looking at the documented needs, we found that enhancement or replacement of enterprise systems as well as vehicle and officer related equipment was necessary, including one of the things we looked at was a communication center emergency phone system, also additional radar devices. And then based on a risk assessment that we worked on them with, we learned that they're not having a secondary location for dispatch could cause an interruption of service should something occur, whether it's a natural event or not at that location. Basically, their dispatch would not be able to mobilize as quickly. So part of that was a recommendation for a secondary or backup location for their dispatch.
Mr. Zalay, hold with us for just a minute. For staff, I think we ought to put that 4.7 million that came out of the road funds that went to WyoLink on that previous slide for communications into the consideration for the ARPA money. Now we'll talk about WyoLink a little bit more in detail, but if we can get that back and put it back in the road fund, I'd rather do that. Director, do you have a comment?
Mr. Chairman, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Zalay, please continue.
Absolutely. So basically looking at that, one of the key points there was the dispatch operations, backup location or secondary location, whether it was a natural or man-made disaster at that location would allow continuing operations. And then of course, on the equipment and enterprise systems, both in the vehicle and officer related equipment, that is, increased likelihood of equipment failure can obviously negatively impact trooper, employee, and public safety. So this was based on a prioritized list, again, that we worked on with WHP and identified in the entirety, 17.1 million was unfunded for that list.
Okay. Mr. Zalay, hold on just a minute. Director, this 17.1 million unfunded for the highway patrol, would that be included in safety, do you think, in the ARPA monies?
Mr. Chairman, that's actually a good question. And I think I need to ask to do some more research on that one, because I bet you it was not. Let's see if, because I think the answer is yes.
Colonel Howard, please, if you have an opinion on that one.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a great idea, and I think that we should research that.
Thank you, both. Okay, staff, if you would include that one also. The 17.1 million for the highway patrol. And that'd be a safety item out of ARPA. I don't know that we can recover all of it, but maybe some of it in the secondary dispatch center. So, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel and Director, this is kind of near and dear to my heart, as you can imagine. We've had discussions over not only what's funded and unfunded here, but specifically phone systems down in the highway patrol dispatch centers. And to the point that, I ran a budget amendment to try to get some discussion going about getting some of those going. Does this include getting not only the highway patrol, but the TMC in general, that entire area downstairs there, does that include getting all of this up to date and getting the people that are taking these phone calls and dispatching out up to par? I just, it's tough to sit there and hear some of the stories that come out of there from, like we'll just say it, some relatives and as well as some other constituents. Have a lot of constituents that work down there. And I'd just like to know if this is encompassing of everything.
Colonel, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Representative Brown. Yes, sir. In fact, it does. We are in need of a replacement phone system, not just the devices, but all everything that comes into the center and goes out of the center is recorded because it potentially becomes criminal and civil evidence. And so with that, it does include that system.
Okay. All right. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question has to relate to body cameras. Is there any way to integrate body cameras into this safety aspect of the funding?
Colonel?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, we would have to go back and take a look, but I do think it's worth researching that. We did take some, I would offer, we did take efforts in the first CARES Act funding to do just that. And it was deemed not eligible at that time, but it's worth this other funding to consider it.
Director.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Baker, just to follow up on that, body cameras is certainly very high on my priority list to make sure that our troopers have them. In today's society for our law enforcement professionals. It's evidence and we need to make sure we have them. So it's very high on our priority list.
Okay, thank you. Just for everyone, because I've been asked, we'll take a break after we're done with the presentation from Dye Management Group. So if you were wondering. So Mr. Zalay, why don't you please continue?
Will do. We have about 6 or 7 more of these to get through, and they go a lot more quickly. I will add that, again, the report does break down the 17.1 million more into those areas of body cameras, vehicle upfitting, protective equipment, and the types of systems that are necessary. And I believe we try to keep each of these sections, or at least these more recent sections, to like a 2 or 3 page summary level with the supplemental assessment or analysis documents available if somebody wants to pour through those. So a lot of these questions in the full report are answered or broken out into a lot more detail than we've summarized here.
Please continue.
Very good. So motor vehicle services has a $9.1 million need currently, or at least at the time we completed this project in October. 9.1 million of that was unfunded. That includes 8 million for the RIS procurement and 9 million for facility security enhancement upgrades, as well as 2 additional FTEs for compliance and investigation. So based on the RIS report, as is affectionately known, they were looking at about $78 million per year, I believe was the total. I'm sorry, $7.8 million per year over 10 years for the cost of that system. Of course, when we looked at the assessment or did the analysis, a lot of that cost, or some of that cost, was more heavily weighted into the first 2 years, but the average amount was correct. But the 2 gaps that we saw on the motor vehicle services side were about $1 million for facility security enhancement upgrades. Public facing agencies tend to or rely on some safety barriers and different things, safety barriers and mechanics in place to allow them to do their job safely. And while we didn't see a substantial amount of reports of that type of or that sort of thing being an issue, there was the assessment or the feeling that that type of upgrades to those facilities would be wise. So the previous amount here was simply reported as the $7.7 million. And that's why this number did go up to 9.1. But again, if we're looking at the RIS system, I think it's probably already been reviewed, the benefits of going to the new system. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but longer wait times for the customers and a lack of a self-service option. These are all ways that you could decrease the impact on YDOT while making motor vehicle services more reliable for the traveling public. Okay, on the aeronautics side, or next slide. Oh, unless we had a question. Okay, on the aeronautics side, we worked with YDOT, reviewed the Wyoming Aviation Capital Improvement Program, and then non-WACIP needs. So YDOT Aeronautics Division worked individually with all the publicly owned airports to understand and validate their true needs, and then reviewed the WACIP against that. So when we talk about true needs, it's one thing to go out and ask folks, what are your needs? And then you get a wish list. It's another to go back and look at a prioritized list of which of these provide the most value and which of these are prioritized. So we based it on a blend of that in our analysis, working with Brian Olson and the aeronautics side folks. So we ended up at a total need of $95 million with a funded need of 50.3 per year, which left us with 44.7 unfunded. So this is based on the, and again, this list is more detailed in the report, but this is based on the true needs from the publicly owned airports, and then also the non-WACIP needs that were unfunded previously. Okay, on the fleet and equipment side, this was a pretty good chunk here. We estimated the fleet replacement budget was cut from about 13.5 million from fiscal year 20 funding levels to 7.5 million. Our previous estimate was based on the FY20 funding levels and FY21 projections. So we did update this slide between, I believe, towards the end of last year when the original amount for the funded was 13.5. But how we got to this 41.5 is the YDOT has a mature and best practice based fleet and equipment management system that looks at the life cycle costs and the optimized replacement for the assets, for those fleet and equipment assets, basically where it becomes more costly to keep the equipment than to buy a new piece of equipment. And based on that, there's about 41.5 million in equipment that needs to be replaced per year. That is only between 7.5 or 13.5 million is being addressed per year. So obviously, with looking at inflation, looking at the fact that some of this equipment will break down and will no longer be repairable, let alone not just be expensive or more expensive to repair than to replace, but also might not be repairable as needed. So if you've got snow plows or you've got other types of trucks that are required for a certain maintenance activity or snow and ice removal, and it's not available when you need it, that directly impacts not just the traveling public, but safety of the traveling public as well. All right, our last two areas here are buildings and facilities, and then we'll talk about design and construction survey equipment. So buildings and facilities was an interesting portion of the assessment. We worked with Kimley Horn, subject matter experts on this, also working internally with the YDOT staff. And the focus here was looking at construction, maintenance, and rehabilitation of the structures, the buildings and facilities. So our method for this was includes the results of the analysis and interviews with district engineers to identify additional facility needs, including functional needs. So functional needs is interesting here because the way a building was originally designed and how it's now being used can make it obsolete. One example that we looked at on this was as snow plows are equipped with wings and they become larger, and the bays that were used to house them and clean them are no longer able to accommodate those, you end up with an issue that's twofold. One is you have an obsolete building, it can't operate or function as intended. You've also got a piece of equipment that's not coming indoors to get washed down, hosed down, pick the salt off of it, which is then in turn reducing the life of that asset that can't get into the facility. So based on that, we looked at a total need on the construction, maintenance, and rehabilitation side of 49.2 million, and only 5.5 million of that is funded. And I apologize, the name of the report, the Dude Solutions report, I just remembered it there, did detail this a few years ago, particularly on the construction and rehabilitation side. But our analysis also included the functional areas and then the maintenance of those areas, working with the district engineers and what they identified. And then our last area is design and construction survey equipment. So small amount of unfunded need here, but it is something that's important. This is basically geology and photogrammetry equipment, survey units, tablets, processing software, what's used to create the projects that we mentioned earlier that are unfunded, what's used to go out and do these types of projects in the design phase. Right now, they're currently replacing these as necessary, but it's well beyond the useful life. And a lot of this equipment that they're using is still not functioning as intended. So long-term, it would be better to replace this on a life cycle, but 2.1 million is what's needed right now to replace the antiquated equipment so that they can get back up to more modern technology for doing this. All right, so that wraps up the portion of how we got to the 354 million. If we could just, I'm jumping back here on my slide deck to slide 5. I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions on any of those areas that we've talked about and how we got to that $354.3 million total.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Obermiller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about the methodology on the bridge and road conditions. Did your company do any independent analysis of the actual conditions of roads and bridges? Or is it based on YDOT data, and what was the nature of that data? Thank you, if that's the case.
Mr. Zalay?
Yes, great question. Thank you. So historically, pavement and bridge have been the most mature asset management systems that exist in any state or in all states because of the federal requirements behind that. Bridge identification, the National Bridge Inventory, the way you have to assess the condition of bridges and the way you have to assess the condition of pavement to get federal matching and get other funds really sets a baseline expectation in any state we go into that the data that's being tracked for those two specific assets is no more accurate than we would be able to go out or work with another firm to go out and collect separately. So that being said, they're also collected much more frequently for the pavement management system and the bridge management system than other assets. So the direct answer to the question is we relied on YDOT data for this, but also understand that the YDOT's data for this has to be accurate and precise because of the federal requirements behind it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Mr. Zalay, there's nothing else in the room. So.
Okay, so just two quick focuses or two quick remaining projects here.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Please.
Mr. Chairman. So I'm looking at this estimated unfunded annual needs. This is just 1 year's worth of unfunded needs, 350 million per year that we need to make up for the highway department. Is that correct?
Mr. Zalay?
Yes, that's correct. 354 million is the gap in unfunded per year for the next 10 years. Now that's
700 million.
Yes, so this is unfunded only, not based on the existing budget that will automatically be allocated towards those funded areas. Yes, that's correct, but it's not just for, it's for all of the areas in total here. So buildings, facilities, aeronautics, everything within the DOT. It is 354 million per year.
Jesus Christ.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zalay, just out of curiosity here, and maybe I missed this and I would apologize if I did. Does this include any growth in personnel costs or anything like that? Or is this strictly looking at the actual functionality of YDOT and what YDOT does? Or does this include, we need to have 10 more employees in this area, 5 more employees in this area, and include salaries and fringe? What do we have in that?
Mr. Zalay?
Great question. Thank you for that. So in certain areas, we all already noted that it would include, so on I think it was on Department of Motor Vehicle Services, we looked at 2 additional inspectors or 2 additional FTEs. We looked at 5 additional FTEs for the IT group as they are on the computer side. As the network grows and their responsibility grows on the software, they would need 5 additional FTEs. By and large, what we heard was that the org charts as they exist right now, if they were populated and all those positions were filled, that would meet the current need. Now, granted, we did not dive into a full staffing analysis or anything like that for this. We looked at based on the increase in the level of effort to address that increase, would additional positions be required? And by and large, it was if we could fill the positions we have, we could address this additional work. And I guess
Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you've not included any inflationary costs in this. So it truly may exceed more than the 350 million a year if we're looking out 10 years. Is that correct?
Mr. Zalay?
Yes, good question. That is correct. Now, in some of these models, like for when we looked at like the $3.5 million per mile of expansion, that's based on an average amount over the next 10 years. So within some of these areas, inflation has been built into the models, particularly based on pavement and bridge. For other areas, it has not. And I believe we call that out in the report when we did apply an inflation or averaged in the inflation over that amount of time.
Right. Other questions? Nothing else in the room, Mr. Zalay.
Okay, so we'll jump to the last two slides. I appreciate that. We did do some focus groups, I guess towards the summer of last year. And during those focus groups, we talked about one of the key topics was the willingness of the traveling public to pay for these, for certain types of delivering a certain level of service related to certain maintenance or highway or any type of asset element. And I wanted to show off this slide here, even though we've documented this more thoroughly in a separate report. As we talk about this unfunded need, there are certainly areas here that the public is willing to pay for that directly relate to very large needs within this unfunded annual needs analysis. So you can see these are based on the average rating of top to bottom. Which of these would you be willing to fund versus which would you not? You can see that pavement markings, roadway surfaces, bridges and overpasses, the width of roadway shoulders, enhancement of snow removal. These were all of the 13 topics that we gave them. These were all in the top 5 for most folks with willingness to pay for. And then we get down to the bottom and we talk about digital messaging sites, guardrail. Well, some of these I may not agree with because they're safety related and you don't really need them until you need them. But you can see that some of these also relate to a lower willingness for the focus groups to pay. So I lost my spot there, I apologize. I think the key thing to take away from this slide is that when you look at prioritizing this $354 million, and I understand that just coming up with $350 million is not an easy task, but some of these areas are higher priorities than other, and some of them directly relate to what the traveling public is interested in or willing to fund. So as you look at where are ways to generate revenue or where are ways to fund some of these type projects, I think that our needs analysis and the focus groups results go hand in hand. All right, so just to summarize here, the first, just some general observations. We have 5 of them here that I would like you to take away from this presentation. The first is that current funding levels are not sustainable for WYDOT. The roads and highways are the backbone of Wyoming's economy. The motorists travel 10.4 billion miles annually, and it's estimated that $66 billion worth of freight is shipped to and from the state each year. But the conditions are deteriorating at a pace that's faster than WYDOT can keep up with it. So while the funding levels historically have allowed them to do some of the work they needed, it's not sustainable moving forward to the future. To address that, there's either the need for more funds or WYDOT will need to cut services. So one example that came up in the previous presentation was the closing of rest areas, which will now be reopened except for one. The potential for reducing snow and ice operations. You have to have money to be able to do these things, and a lack of funding causes tough decisions. And I'll make another point here. A lot of times where you cut the funding is not a decision you can make. Snow and ice removal, if it's a historically bad winter, that further enhances the inability to fund additional projects. If you're spending double what you intended or expected on snow and ice removal during winter season, that cuts substantial amount of funding from construction season and maintenance season. Also, I mentioned this throughout the presentation about life cycle costs. Underfunding asset preservation results in a higher cost for the entire life of the asset. And FHWA, Federal Highway Administration, other independent studies have been done that basically show that spending $1 before the asset gets to a point where it's needed to be rehabilitated or replaced can save the $8 of cost later that will be required to do that replacement. So it's, as we say, car mechanics said all the time to me growing up, pay me a little now or pay me a lot more later. You've got to do these things to maintain the roads, to maintain these assets in a condition that's viable long term, so that replacement is not an option or not required. So I also mentioned a little bit about bullet 4, so I won't reiterate that, but there is a direct alignment between what the citizens are willing to pay and where you have critical needs. So those two reports will go hand in hand. And finally, a performance-based approach will help YDOT developing an optimized budget that focuses on the prioritized area. And what we mean by this is that when you look at performance-based and you look at the outcomes of any asset, meaning is this asset operating and it's as intended? What is the level of service or the condition of this asset? And then you can apply this this approach that I've mentioned in bullet 3 there, spending the dollar at the right time in the right place, rather than just looking at a list of projects and we'll get to them when we can get them done. You're spending your money more wisely, but you're also prolonging the life of the assets. So now, pavement management, bridge management operate in this world. Maintenance operates in this world. Aeronautics is moving in this direction and has moved to this direction, I should say. We talked with Highway Patrol about being able to be more performance-based, looking at the analytics of the time to address calls, the time that is spent addressing crashes, or where a crash occurs, where a crash has already occurred because of lack of ability to get there, and then optimizing their locations and their equipment to minimize those occurrences. So basically, as we talk about performance, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different components of the DOT or elements of the DOT. But as we can move them more towards performance-based, it becomes easier to show where the money needs to go versus not. And with that, I'll open it up to any final questions.
Any questions? So, Mr. Zalay, I want to thank you for your time and for the presentation. I don't see any questions here in the room. Director.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, just one simple closing thought. For me, I thank Dye Management for their effort on this. They worked hard on it. And our staff worked hard on it. For me and for us here, I think it provides us a data point. It understands the big picture, and it's important because we addressed YDOT all. So all 5 components of YDOT versus just roads and bridges. And I think that type of perspective is important. It certainly helped us guide and build our guiding principles and our budget priorities, which you'll see tomorrow. So this set the conditions for that. There's certainly, nobody's going to send us $350 million more a year, but the data here helps sort of define, hey, what does success look like as we make wise use of the available fiscal assets that we have.
All right. Thank you, Director. Representative or Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I heard earlier that we were working on a detour around Elk Mountain. Is that Highway 30 or is it a different detour?
Director?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, if that project came to fruition, it would follow the Highway 30 route.
Representative Baker.
What's the projected cost on that, Mr. Chairman?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, 6.1 billion with a B. I wouldn't expect to do it. It's 19 miles, 4 lanes. I mean, so it's expensive. The argument is if you're looking for big projects that affect the national economy, there is one that you could consider.
All right. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Mr. DeSoleil, if you're still on, and your team there in Seattle. With that, before I open it to public comment, I think we'll take a break. Let's be back at 20 till 5. And that puts us a little behind schedule. So just a caution. It's 4:40, so we'll get back at it. We're now about 10 minutes behind schedule if you plan on going to 6, which we don't have to. I will not go beyond 6, so if you don't get your opinion and point of view in by 6, I guess you're out of luck, at least until tomorrow. So with that, we'll discuss WyoLink updates and funding. We have who's representing the working group?
Mr. Chairman,
Okay, Kelly, yes, I'm sorry.
I don't know if there is, Mr. Chairman, but right before our break, you said. that
Oh,
public
that's right.
Public comment on the.
Thank you.
News report would be after a break.
Thank you very much, Heather. Okay, before we get started, are there any public comments in the room on the presentation from the dye management group? Okay, I see none. Are there any on the internet?
Mr. Chairman, there are not.
Okay, with that, I'll close public comment. Now we'll move on to WyoLink. Thank you again, Heather. Somebody has to keep me on track. So, Kelly, you're representing the working group?
Yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Kelly Little. I'm with the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. I'm joined today by my colleague Jeremiah Riemann, who is the Executive Director of the WCCA. We're going to talk a little bit about the work group, but I thought it would be good to start off this afternoon with some background information on WyoLink. There are some new members of the committee who may not understand the historical aspects of the program. So I'm going to turn that over actually to our friends from WYDOT to give some background on WyoLink, and then we'll talk about the interim committee topic.
All right. Mr. Babbitt, I take it that you're the designated presenter.
I am, Mr. Chairman. So
Please.
Mr. Chairman, again, Troy Babbitt, the Chief Technology Officer of WYDOT. WyoLink is one of the systems underneath my emergency communications department. So I will just give a brief synopsis of some of these slides here. Slide number 3, certainly WyoLink is a statewide system. It's a public safety system. It's interoperable, it's dependable, and it's a radio communications system. So that's very important in the state of Wyoming with the rural territory that we have. Understanding the difference between radio technology, which we cover the entire state with the number of towers that we have compared to cell phone technologies, which, basically produces a signal about every 40 miles. And we push that signal much further with the radio system. And we do maintain the infrastructure on that. So next slide, a little bit of background about WyoLink. Of course, it was created because of the 911 Commission with emergency responders not being able to communicate with each other. That's what really started it. It was awarded in 2005. Since that point in time, we've built currently, well, we did have 77 towers, and we're under construction on the other 16 towers. And a lot of those are partnerships with counties too. So they certainly bring skin to the table of what they've built on infrastructure and their radios for the local systems as well. So over 500 agencies are on the system with over 16,000 users, more than 16,000 users. That number is a little bit challenging sometimes because there's an awful lot of radios that go into a cache system that don't get used until there is an emergency event. But 98% statewide coverage and over $120 million invested. And that's from the state side. I think that's the challenge that we're talking about, of understanding the local contributions of what they've all put in there as well. So it was designed to allow local agencies to migrate onto the systems, and as funding allows. And then this is the 6-year system maintenance agreement that we talked about, including hardware replacement on systems. The Quantars getting upgraded to the GTR, DC power plants, the radios, and of course the maintenance agreement. Next slide. WyoLink had 23 million calls in 2019 and 20. Numbers were down just a little bit because of COVID, and a number of vehicles on the road backed off a little bit there. Of course, power is in the collective whole. Interoperable communications is across multiple agencies. We strive to make each and every one of those departments local entities that come to us that apply for that get qualified to put on the system, and we work with them closely. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Senator.
Mr. Chairman, is that 23 million calls in adding up those 2 years or exclusively
adding up
per year?
Adding up those 2 years.
Oh.
Sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Babbitt.
Currently funding for the WyoLink user fee base is currently being paid out of the MRG local government Capcom account for their percentage on the maintenance agreement. Long-term solution, that's why we're here. We talked about this work group. And we do believe that the key is keeping users onto our network and making that expansion continue to be stronger and stronger. And we're building it to be able to be more interoperable with whatever that next technology is, whether that be cell phones or whatever it may be. That's we're working with other local agencies as well as other neighboring states and what systems that they have, the interoperability between them. So.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the County Commissioners Association. I'm going to take the next slide, slide 6. As Mr. Babbitt mentioned, one of the frustrations for local governments has been that the investments they have made in the system are not always recognized as part of the equation for determining their portion of the responsibility. And so I've mentioned there that over the course of time, and we're going to work to get you more accurate data here, but we know that counties in particular have spent tens of millions of dollars on radios, as well as installing a number of towers across the state. And we need to make sure that that's more reflected in our conversation. And that becomes critically important in terms of the next 2 bullet points on this slide.
Mr. Riemann, a question
Yes.
quickly. Just if you have the number, how many towers have the counties themselves installed?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that number off the top of my head. Mr. Babbitt may.
Mr. Babbitt?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it's approximately 15.
Okay, thank you. Nice number.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, the next bullet there talks about those faux invoices that have been referenced. That was a request of our association of the department so that the local governments, and that includes not only counties, but also special districts, your schools and others that are using the system. So we could understand what our portion of the cost could be and in relationship to the amount that is coming out of the mineral royalty grant in particular. We do appreciate that has been a backstop source of funding out of the Office of State Lands and Investment, but it is a finite resource and will come to an end here shortly at the end of this biennium. As well, by pulling from that particular source of funding, you're taking money out of a pot of resource that's critical for other public safety investments. When, say, one of your communities has a sewer system go down or a water system, that's a backstop that exists, and it's important that we find alternative resources. Mr. Chairman, there's been reference to the user fee system. It is critical, and it's been referenced that this is a voluntary system for local governments to enter onto. As a result of that fear of the budget expense coming back to local governments, many of the counties have actually continued to maintain analog systems. So, Mr. Chairman, your county is one of those. Fremont County is another that are doing that in the event that if they were to see one of those faux bills become reality, they would switch back. And I think from a lot of different perspectives, that's not what we want. We want a fully functional state system that local governments can participate in and rely upon and not have that budgetary concern. It's important for our citizens, frankly, from an emergency perspective, that they have that capability. Mr. Chairman, the last thing that I'll mention relative to this slide is, the governor in his last budget requested that the local governments be assigned 70% of the total cost of the usage. And I think that that's based on one approach. There are a couple of them that could be contemplated. One is the number of clicks on the system. One of them is the amount of time you're spending on the system. We need to determine what the most appropriate distribution is if we're going to use that approach. We appreciate that you did not impose that as a condition, but we know that it's at least part of the conversation. And so we want to seek an alternative approach here.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you. So, Mr. Riemann, thank you. When you indicate on the slides that Sublette County has developed an interoperable system, by interoperable, do you mean that they can stand alone or they can interact with WildLink, or interoperable pertaining to what?
Mr. Riemann?
Mr. Chairman, as I understand it, yes, Sublette County can stand on its own, but it is, the two systems are capable of communicating, and Mr. Babbitt certainly has more on that.
Mr. Babbitt?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. It's a different vendor. They are, we have done testing to make sure it's an ISSI type connection. It's a subsystem interface to make sure that two different systems can talk together. And we've tested that. So we do have two different systems that can work together.
Just a quick follow-up, Mr.
Follow-up.
Chairman. So I'm just curious what led to that, Mr. Babbitt. Maybe it's that they had enough money to do that, or what prompted them to be the only county to go on their own?
Mr. Babbitt?
Mr. Chairman, a little bit of past history. When I first stepped into that position, there were several counties that were maybe unhappy that maybe didn't have a very good communication role with WYDOT, and did have the funds to maybe take a look at it. I think we've made a lot of changes since that point in time. We've addressed those things. I think we had a chance we almost convinced them to stay onto the system, but I shouldn't say unfortunately, they did decide to go with another vendor at that point in time.
I agree. I think we gained a lot of ground. So thank you.
All right. So, Mr. Riemann, continue, or unless you're done and we're moving to Mr. Babbitt again.
Mr. Chairman, next slide. This gives a little clarification, and I can be a little more clear as your comment before when we were talking about the 4.7 million. The last budget session, we did not get any appropriations to move forward, but the Quantars and GTRs desperately needed to get upgraded. So we worked with the vendor and got a long-term contract for 6 years to be able to start that process, break it into 3 different bienniums. And that's what that contract amount was. So
Mr. Babbitt, that was what we had previously discussed with the dye management.
Correct.
Group.
Yes, sir.
Funding. Thank you.
Next bullet point, it just kind of describes the 16 new towers that we've started. 7 of those are now online. Buffalo, Orange Junction, Wright, Jackson, Grable, Alcova, and Lusk. And Alva is very close, getting a fiber line installed out to it. And then the 8 other sites, 2 in Rock Springs, Newcastle, Tensleep, Evanston, Bighorn County, Goshen County, and Bondurant are all in various sections of construction, and they're all on track, just at various stages.
Mr. Babbitt, a quick question. So pretty much all of these towers are pretty much line of sight from the radios connected to them. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Next line. One of the complaints that we had heard in the past with our system that wasn't allowing for paging. This is very important for your fire departments, as well as having indoor communications. We are continuing to make sure that the next generation allows for that to meet the fire department's needs, as well as better indoor coverage is the goal on that. Interoperability, we mentioned a couple of these type of things. We're making sure that whatever we do is going to meet the next generation or be able to interoperate with FirstNet, which is by AT&T. That's LTE, long-term evolution type technology. I'm getting into the weeds there, but it's basically cell phone technology. So
okay, Mr. Babbitt, with that, say 5 years from now, and technology is moving at an extremely accelerating pace, will WyoLink be compatible with, say, the entire communication system used roughly 5 years from now, or will it have become obsolete? That's an opinion on your part.
Mr. Chairman, from all the national conventions that I've been in, I think long-term evolution, LMR, which is land mobile radio, WyoLink, is going to be here for at least another decade.
Okay, thank you.
And we are building it to make sure that it does operate with those future.
Okay, thank you.
Communications.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator McCune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just curious, did we ever explore a SATCOM system? It's I don't know what the cost is, so it truly is a question. It just seems it would be simpler than BHF.
Okay, Mr. Babbitt?
Mr. Chairman, from my perspective, I believe that's in the future. Certainly in the past, satellite was pretty much a downlink type thing because there was so much latency with an uplink backup. It was not worth voice communications. VHF has been proven to be rock solid, and at that point in time, we had a huge investment in the system, and we just have continued down that road.
Okay, please continue.
And the last bullet point, of course, House Bill 15, the broadband initiative, gives us the opportunity to lease space if in fact there is space available on towers. And we have communications with all the internet service providers. There's also opportunity with getting fiber optic. The old network was based on microwave, and now we have the opportunity with the technology merging together. So if we get fiber optics, it just drops that information off, gets it faster. And separates the network as not a domino effect. If one section goes down, the entire northern leg goes down. We're eliminating that, making redundancy capable with fiber optic connections where we can. So.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Babbitt, any interest on the part of companies out there with regard to some of the towers? I'm just curious. We made them available. I'm just wondering if there's going to be any takers.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Babbitt?
definitely. As we try and push out broadband to those a lot of these locations are up in the mountains, high locations, very low population, but people at ranches may need it. So depending on the service provider and the size of their dish, that's really the dependency. If there's space there, cell phone technology has gigantic towers that, and then you have to consider the wind ratio and the height and, all the structural analysis and the security of the building and all those kind of things that go with it. We've shared it with our internet service providers, and we do have some takers that are expanding broadband out to those rural locations.
Okay, good news. Thank you.
And then finally, this shows just the updated map of where those locations are, the existing sites, and then the yellow ones are the 16 new towers that are being built.
Okay.
Mr.
Raymond,
Chairman.
it's your turn again.
Yes, it is. Sorry, we're trying to be efficient for you here by doing this jointly. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to just speak about the American Rescue Plan very briefly. First off, just offer our support and thanks for your consideration of a piece of legislation to use that funding for the next 4 years. And we'll talk about what happens after that here shortly. I also want to express appreciation for the consideration of including locals in that. But in doing that, I want to also offer some information and perhaps some clarification about the local government portion of funds incoming. The counties as well as the municipalities will receive funding from the American Rescue Plan. My counties, your counties will receive roughly $112 million. That funding will come directly. The municipalities as well will receive a portion of fund. I believe the number is closer to $62 million for all 99 municipalities in the state. Now, the counties will receive that money directly from the Treasury. And as I understand it, Casper and Cheyenne will also receive that money directly from the Treasury. The other 97 municipalities will receive their checks through the state. And I don't know any more details about it. But I also want to just say that the American Rescue Plan and the way it's distributed doesn't necessarily benefit every community equally. And what I mean by that is 2 counties in the state will receive roughly $40 million of that $112 million. So there are many small counties or smaller counties and municipalities that even if they wanted to invest in this system, wouldn't have the full resources and capabilities. So you're making available some of the state resource for that is certainly critical and identifying how we do that. So I appreciate that consideration and be happy to answer any questions as we move forward. with the local government portion, and I will be urging a lot of patience from local governments as they consider this funding, much as you are all going to be expressing. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I think we want to talk about the working group and what we're trying to accomplish for you.
All
Ms.
right,
Little, it's your turn.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I do want to talk about the 2021 interim WildLink work group that's being spearheaded by our organization. The goal of this work group is to find a sustainable long-term funding solution for the maintenance and software and hardware system upgrades of the WildLink system for all users. And if possible, we would like the work group to identify one or more recommendations to bring to you all to be a long-term solution for that funding. As was mentioned, we support the use of ARPA funding for the present needs of WildLink. However, we understand that this is one-time funding and there would still need to be a long-term solution down the road. We don't want to be back at square one 4 years from now trying to figure out a funding solution for this system when, or if and when those ARPA funds run out. If possible, or excuse me, we are evaluating many varied and different revenue streams for this system. And, honestly, we've told the work group that all ideas are on the table. Bring us whatever ideas you have and we will evaluate them. That includes, fees, taxes, surcharges, but also the possibility of changing a current distribution formula to divert funding that's already there to cover the costs of the system. So like I said, we're just evaluating any and all ideas that could be a possibility to help cover the cost for this system.
Ms. Little?
Yes.
A question. How quickly do you think you can come to a resolution on suggested funding? I mean, we're looking at potential to start allocating the ARPA money, what's available, depending on all the intricacies of that. With a special session July, I'd round it off and say 12th. And this committee is looking at the potential to start putting together proposals the 21st of June. So I guess my question is can you come up with this by then to give us enough time to work on your recommendations?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that there's like a relationship there between, the ARPA funding and whether that's going to be available, and that creates an urgency or doesn't create an urgency to come up with a solution. We want to find a solution this interim, whether the ARPA funding is available or not, because like I said, 4 years down the road, that's a problem. But I think that when you get the ARPA funding, if it's available, that's a Band-Aid. It gives us a little bit of time to figure it out, but doesn't give us a lot. If it's not available, if for some reason there's more guidance that comes to Treasury saying that it doesn't really fit, then the need becomes very urgent, and that creates. I believe that we will be able to come up with a solution to bring to you all in the month of June or after the special session, even if we have to do that, if the ARPA funding is available. Did you want to add anything to that, Jeremiah?
Mr. Riemann, I guess, without putting this as a question, the ARPA money is going to come up, it's going to be allocated. And I would dare to say that if you aren't on the list, you don't get any.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're asking is will you be on the list? We've talked about it this morning with the department of using that money wherever we can, and doing so potentially very quickly. While it is, I agree with Ms. Little, it is a Band-Aid. I think we need to at least have an idea of how to use it and push forward with that. I'm willing to accept free money, and this is something we've discussed the funding for years. Even if we can get some of that to finish out the towers, finish out hardware, I know it doesn't solve long-term, but it takes care of those immediate needs. And I would really ask you to have some working information for us well before the 21st of June, please.
Mr. Chairman, if I can, the way I look at it is, I can kind of compartmentalize things here. First off, the ARPA money. And as I understand it, YDOT does have available, and we can make that, we can get that in front of you in advance of the June 21st meeting, what it would take in order to fund this system for the next 3 to 4 years under the timelines of that particular funding for the Quantars, for the towers, for the operations and maintenance. I think the commitment you have from us is to ensure that you have an understanding of what are the local government needs in terms of consoles and radios during that particular period of time, so that you can plug that number into the system. And we can offer guidance too on perhaps how that should be structured, how local governments might access it in an appropriate manner. I think the other compartment is what is the solution beyond ARP, and that is really where Ms. Little is trying to work with this working group. And I would suggest we could bring you some ideas of what that could look like in June, but I don't know that we will have fully fleshed all of them out. I could share some today, but at the risk of them not being the real solution here. So yes, we will give you what you need for ARP.
Thank you. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Riemann, Ms. Little, thank you. I think that the issue that the chairman is trying to get at is that all of us are going to have to take a little bit of a leap of faith, even on some of the other avenues that we talked about with regard to this funding. And so we appreciate you guys kind of pushing that envelope a little bit, knowing that maybe we can at least land in the ballpark. And then certainly from that point forward, we've still got work to do with this system and where we go from there, long-term funding, all of that sort of stuff. And I know the committee is going to be ready to work on that with the department and with you guys. But we would just ask anything you can do to kind of get a leap of faith and get a couple of specifics that we can take forward to July. That's how committed we are, that we want to make sure that we get our local governments involved here. So thank you for that.
So continue.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So moving on, the work group, just some background on the work group. The work group consists of members that are users of the system. That includes the WCCA and county commissioners, county sheriffs, the cities, police departments, fire departments, school boards, and YDOT. We also have some, advisory capacity members, including the Wyoming vendor, the telecommunications industry, and the Wyoming Taxpayers Association. And the work group actually met for the first time last week. It was our, initial meeting. We kind of provided it as an introduction to the premise and what we were trying to accomplish, and began evaluating possible solutions. And our goal is to meet again and meet again in June and meet frequently after that to continue the work of the work group and come up with a solution that may need to be implemented this year, depending on the ARP funding, or, long-term would be a solution that could fund the system down the road. And that's all.
And we all appreciate the help. We would rather all of the users solve the problem than you coming to us and say, solve the issue, because you probably won't like the solution if we do. Hopefully you'll like your own solution. Anything else from people at the table? Mr. Babbitt.
Mr. Chairman, if I could have you move on to the next tab, I'd just like to let you notify you of the Public Safety Commission's report that is due every odd year to this committee as well as the governor. It's in draft. There are a couple edits that need to be made. But I do want to draw, we have rebranded. That is the new logo for WildLink that's been accepted just recently here. And then if you would turn to page 4, that actually shows the breakdown of the numbers that we've been talking about. That first line is the system maintenance agreement. And that's the number that gets broken apart, 70% to the locals, 30% to YDOT paying for the state. So that's that portion. And then there's the GTR and the DC power plants for the totals. So it shows the 2 bienniums there. And then we would have one more, we would be completed with the GTR upgrade. So.
And Mr. Babbitt, when will the final report be done after the 1st of July, I believe. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, we were hoping to have it done by the end of this month.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the committee? All right, thank you. With that, I'll open public testimony on WildLink. Anyone in the room? Please. Ms. Legursky.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Erica Legursky, Governor Gordon's office. I was planning on sitting quietly in the back and not testifying, but I just wanted to give you guys some information if you would like to.
Please.
So information on some ARPA funding, I just wanted to let you know. So the governor's office has received half of what we were going to receive for that ARP funding. So it's about $534,242,384. So that is, Treasury had given some guidance out that if you did not make 2% of your unemployment rate, if you didn't have a decrease in that, then you would get it in tranches. So that's our first tranche. So we haven't received the entire 1.06 billion. It was alluded to that the city of Casper and the city of Cheyenne will each be getting their own funding. Casper will get about 1.9 million. Cheyenne will get about 12.2 million. The counties will get directly the 112 million. And then they have what they call non-entitlement units, which is Town of Franny, Town of Yoder. That money is going to come directly to the governor's office. Right now, the last figure that I saw projected was 47.8 million. We will probably get half of that because the state got half of our money. We will have a finite time period, about 30 days, once we receive guidance from them to turn around and give that to those non-entitlement units. And it'll be based, my understanding is based on a formula that they give us. So they'll tell us how much Yoder gets, how much Franny gets, and we'll just pass that along. So we're working very closely with the state budget department and the state auditor's office to anticipate that money coming. So just wanted to let you know that that was what our office knew of those. So if there's any questions on that.
Questions for Ms. Legursky?
And then the only other question, if there's no other questions, Mr. Chairman, was just regarding what some of the conversations and the statewide calls that we've been on regarding ARPA funding. They keep talking about monitoring, and making sure there's so many different pots of money. Right now, I think it's about 300 pots of money that are floating around, and making sure that we're not duplicating the efforts on those. And so as I was sitting here, and I think that the county and WYDOT is very well aware that the Wyoming Office of Homeland Security has grants that they give out. And I was just on that interoperable committee that they did. And I do know that we gave grant funding to some counties and cities regarding radios and pagers. And so just as we're figuring out those figures, just wanted to make sure that we're not duplicating those funds, because I don't want to have to pay any of that back. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, that we need to just monitor those different pots of money.
Co-Chairman Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Legursky, thank you. I think those cautions are well placed. But my question is, can you give us any indication as to what level of support we might get from the executive branch on this? You can tell that we're interested in doing all we can to shore up this safety communication system of ours. Is that something that will be well received if we can push this through?
Ms. Legursky, please.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Landon, I do believe that we will. One of the things that the director and I had talked about, we tried to push through with the governor's support some initial funding for WildLink and the CARES money. But due to the fact that it was already budgeted and we had some things, that's where some of those restraints were. So I do think that one of the things that I put through on my side as a suggestion, because we did suggestions as well as other directors, was WildLink and some support for that. So I do think that would be looked favorably upon. I am not on the strike team that's looking at all of those, but we have put those recommendations through there.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Ms. Legursky, thanks. I think you could tell that some of us are, pretty adamant about going forward with something that might help. When you live in a frontier state like we do, with the limited health resources that we have, the struggles that we've had with everything from air ambulance to all of the issues that we all know about, it just seems to me that we wouldn't be doing the right thing if we didn't go after it. Now it would be up to this committee to push it through if we decide to do that, but thanks for your thoughts on that. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, other public testimony in the room? Anyone else in the room? Okay. Amanda, anyone on the internet?
Mr. Chairman, there is no one else.
Okay. One last call on this one. WyoLink, any other public testimony? Okay, with that, I'll close public testimony. Thank you very much. Next topic will be the communicator CPR. Mr. Garrett, please come up.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, what a pleasure it is to be here today. Without a mask, I am going to do so.
Okay,
Thank you. Richard Garrett with the American Heart Association. I'm State Government Relations Director. But it is truly an honor and a privilege to be here today and to bring to you an opportunity for Wyoming to improve everyone's quality of life in our beautiful state. And not just your constituents, all of the residents of this state, but also potentially the lives of people that are visiting here as well. This is a simple concept. I won't say that it's necessarily an easy concept to implement. I'm looking forward to working with a lot of stakeholders to make sure that we do this exactly right. But in terms of the concept, it is very simple. What we envision, if I can walk you through a scenario, is that when a person or persons are suffering what seem to be a heart attack out, in Franny or Yoder or Lander or Casper or Gillette or anywhere else in this lovely state, they would call an emergency dispatch. They dial 911. And if they were not able to administer CPR through their own firsthand knowledge of those techniques, the dispatcher receiving that call would be able to coach them through how to administer CPR if that was an appropriate process and avenue in order to save a person's life. As you mentioned, we live in a rural state, a frontier state. We're often at great distances from healthcare and from emergency services. And in fact, in Fremont County, and I believe other counties in this state as well, we're about to lose our ambulance service. So this technique, when properly applied, could potentially save quite a few lives. The American Heart Association has found that in Texas, for example, where this was just adopted unanimously by both sides of the legislature in that state and signed into law by that state's governor, our evidence suggests we can save as many as 33% more lives by employing this particular technique. I mentioned that I want to work with other stakeholders. I think that there are opportunities under ARPA to offset potential costs to our friends at the counties that are responsible for emergency dispatch services. And I'm looking forward to working with those folks for sure on this issue if it is the committee's pleasure that we do so. You've got a handout. I don't know if I've explained this adequately. I'm definitely glad to answer questions. I had about a 2-hour presentation, but the chair admonished us that we didn't want to extend beyond 6 o'clock. So,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
I just broke out in a little bit of a rash when you said 2-hour presentation, but no, Mr. Garrett, thank you for being here. And I'm intrigued by this. I've got a little bit of a history with this issue, having brought it on behalf of the schools, and we never were able to implement that requirement in our high schools. But my question to you is, what would this entail? Where's the cost, and what is it in the education and preparation of our 911 operators? Can you help me with that?
Mr. Garrett.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you for that question. I think that those costs do need to be identified. I can draw on costs of implementation from other states to help guide us through that process. From my perspective, they're fairly minimal. I believe that many dispatchers already know these techniques through their own firsthand training in administering CPR. And it's simply a matter of translating those into communication skills over a telephone primarily in order to help a person move through a process of helping to save a person's life. If I may, a first person story very quickly. In 2006, I was visiting my brother overnight in Denver, Colorado. And my sister-in-law called down to me and said that my brother was in some distress and to come quickly. Got up to his room and it was apparent that he was having a heart attack. So my sister-in-law called 911. And I was familiar with CPR techniques, but she was not. And the dispatcher, that Denver, Colorado emergency dispatcher, stayed on the line and coached us both through administering CPR. And I won't say that that's the only thing that saved my brother's life, but I think it was an important factor in saving his life. And that's, I think, what we can do in Wyoming. And I really don't think it will be very costly. And I think within the scope of the ARPA funding, we can probably find resources to help offset any costs that would be imposed on counties. Again, learning from the last discussion, I want to very much work with the counties to make sure that we do this exactly right. I don't want to outrun my headlights here, but I think that we could have some information that's useful to the committee well before June 21st, if the committee believes this is something that could be included in consideration during a special session. I definitely don't want to speak on behalf of county commissioners. Maybe they'd have other thoughts on that, but I feel pretty confident that we could get you some numbers. Yeah. A great question, and one that I don't feel as though I'm accomplished enough to answer, Mr. Chairman, so my apologies.
Mr. Chairman. To answer your question directly, although Mr. Garrett was not necessarily probably prepared for that question, it would be a perfect nexus, in my opinion. And the reason being is because Next Gen 911, as I previously stated, is the capability of what you see in the movies and the TV shows, where when you make a call, people can, the 911 operator can actually locate you. Right now, that's just not possible in the state of Wyoming. As it was earlier stated, it's located via your residence, if that's the case. If you have worked with the privacy issues with your carrier and everything else, they have that capability if the 911 center has that. None of our 911 centers have that capability right now. So to this exact issue, that would help. A 911 operator might be able to start performing CPR or helping that person perform CPR while they're waiting for an ambulance, while they're trying to find out where they're even located. And it could provide life-saving measures. So absolutely.
Thank you. Co-Chairman Landon.
I guess I'm trying to process this idea, Mr. Garrett. I think it's a good one, whether or not we would want to push forward with anything for the special session. I'm leaning toward maybe not seeing quite the urgency there on that front. But I, for one, am interested enough to see if you'd like to work with the counties and maybe bring us something back at a second meeting of our committee. And unless I see a whole bunch of head shakes, no, I think it is an issue in a state like ours. I think we probably all have anecdotal stories, personal stories that, we have a lake cabin, and about 3 years ago, they pulled a gentleman out across the lake. I wasn't in the group, but the group called 911. None of them really felt comfortable performing CPR, and the gentleman did not make it. Now, whether or not they could have saved him, it's worth trying, and it seems to me like this has some merit, Mr. Chairman. So that's where I'm at with it. I'd be interested in hearing from the committee, and maybe take it up again in the second meeting and go from there.
Okay. Committee, any comments? I don't see any. I think that's a reasonable approach. I'm not sure how it would fit with the ARPA money, but I don't think we had planned this, kind of pivoting it on ARPA money. It was something we took up as an interim topic because it was a good topic. So Mr. Garrett, I think at that point, I'd ask that maybe consider that. We'll work on that between now and our next meeting. Anything else for us before I open public comment?
No, Mr. Chairman, but I do thank you for that. I think that that's a terrific idea. And I'm really eager to work with the county commissioners. And I can certainly share model legislation. And I guess the only thing that I would add is I want to thank the LSO for helping to arrange my presentation today. They did an extraordinary job keeping me on task, and I very much appreciate that. So
thank you. Yeah. Thank you, staff. So with that, I'll open it for public comment. Anyone in the room wish to comment? All right. I don't see anyone. Anyone on the internet?
Mr. Chairman, there is no one virtually.
Okay. With that, I'll close public comment. Thank you, Mr. Garrett, very much. So with that wraps up the day, and we are actually a little ahead of schedule. I'd ask staff if you could recap those things that we've assigned or need to do between now and just as a recap on the day so that we don't lose track of them.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. We just double checking. Okay. The bill drafts that the committee has requested are the draft legislation regarding covenants and the buffer zone with the Oregon Trail Cemetery. The draft legislation regarding use of the Military Assistance Trust Fund to expanding that use. Draft legislation similar to Senate File 128 with regarding the delegation of parental authority. And then drafting and sort of an omnibus, simply that meaning just several different topics brought into one safety topic that would include the WildLink emergency communication system and the RIS and possibly local governments and equipment needs and the capacity purchase. And then the thing that I'm unclear about with respect to that omnibus bill is whether it should include or may or may not include anything from the counties, but I think that would be for discussions perhaps with the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. If that would be appropriate for that bill, I don't know, just because it's with the WildLink. And then I think that the direction from the committee was not to include communicator CPR in that safety bill. Not for now, but that would be a directive for the next meeting. And then additional there, I just have several other items that could be a part of that omnibus bill. So for example, if it's not already called out in the 17 million for highway patrol, that body cameras or just looking at different safety items. And I just sort of have calling out some of those and then references back to the slides.
And the 3.5 million on fuel tax.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's what I was meaning by references back to the slides. I thought that it was 4.7 million, but is there also a 3.5 million?
I'm sorry.
I thought that was 4.7 million, but is there also a 3.5 million piece?
The 4.7 million was for the communications equipment that was taken out of the highway funds to recoup that back to the highway fund.
Okay,
It
and
was a
then,
safety issue, and that's where that money should, if ARPA money is available, it should go back to the highway fund because it was in effect to me borrowed.
and
out of that
3.5 million was what was lost from fuel tax from lack of travel and
Correct.
things like that during COVID.
Correct.
From uncollected fuel taxes. Okay, right. Thank you. And then the additional things that the committee referred to were as far as wanting certain things for the next meeting. For example, wanting the Department of Health to participate in the next update about the Veteran Skilled Nursing Facility.
And that's on staffing mainly.
Right.
Okay.
And then another thing for the next meeting is this coming back from the American Heart Association with regard to the CPR topic. And then, and also, yes, also ideas for no more accidents with snowplows. That was a big one to come back to the next meeting. And additionally, I think that is a recap of the bills. And I do have a note, but this will be immediate, not even before next meeting. But I'm looking to, I believe, forward to the committee the entire DI company presentation. Is that?
I think some of us
refer to it.
already have it. I would ask the committee, I think it was available on, mine was on the internet or sent to me as an email. But I asked the committee, do you want the entire DI management report or not?
Mr. Chairman, I saw a couple nods. It seems like folks could delete the email if they don't want it.
Right. I'll do this then. If you want the entire report, let Heather know. And that I think I may have got it from you or Mary Beth, one of you.
Well, Mr.
two.
Chairman, I double checked and I did not send it to you. I sent
Okay.
you the
All right,
presentation.
maybe I got
So
it from.
I'm not sure.
Why don't we do this?
Just send it.
It does.
Yeah.
Okay, send it to Heather, and if anyone on the committee wants a copy, let Heather know and she can forward it to you. How's that?
Sure. It's
Okay.
easiest to just send it to the whole committee and y'all can delete it if you don't want it,
Yeah,
but.
if you want it, you do, and if you don't, you don't.
Okay, sounds great.
And I think one final thing, Mr. Reedman, did the County Commissioner Association want to present again at the next committee meeting on WyoLink? Okay, so we'll put that on the agenda for the next committee meeting, an update from the WyoLink working group.
Oh, certainly, Mr. Chairman. Things that did not come, there will be a whole agenda of topics that we hadn't addressed and then things that will come back, certainly.
Okay, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might have misheard or heard this the wrong way, but I know the director brought up the capacity funding for the airports as maybe something to consider. Did I hear that wrong?
We already have that.
Did you include it?
Yes.
But what about the project on the runways, like in Cheyenne and so on? Have you heard anything about them needing some additional money to take the opportunity to do some more with this project?
Director? No, okay.
Additional requirements of movement now. I'll check with Brian, but nothing, Mr. Olson, but nothing is forward now like on that. I know it's a 3-year. I know, we're receiving funding from the military. Certainly it's a combination of money between federal, local, and DOD. But my sense was that we were tracking.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I bring this up because I had a conversation with the folks who had the airport there just a week or so back, and they said we may have an opportunity to use, they mentioned a sum of 10 million in regards to lengthening the airport to increase the economic opportunity potential of that runway going forward at this point while we're doing the runway construction repair.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
what I might
Director.
suggest is I'll call Administrator Olson. He's with actually the Aeronautical Commission as we speak. So I'll call him and get the answer to that and bring it back.
Director,
tomorrow.
yes, if you'd bring that back to at least Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so I think, Mr. Co-Chairman, you had some comments.
Just a final thought, Mr. Chairman. I think we've covered everything from today. Good work, and it hopefully is a good foundation to get us started. I was intrigued by something that we saw this morning, committee, and heard from our county. And that was the need to address a lack of ability to access grant funds. And I really, that really resonated with me. And I might ask our county representatives, county commissioner representatives who are headed to Rock Springs tonight, I think, if you would give some thought to that. What if we could come up with a position that might help our counties out across the state to write some grants and get after some grant funding? And I don't know, it would be a start. And committee, I would challenge all of us to think about that. Yeah. Where might we place something like that? What would be the expectations? We can't hire 23 of them. But I thought it really had some merit. And so that's all, Mr. Chairman. And I see where the representative has a comment maybe.
Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So part of that comes from the government efficiency study that we did a couple of years ago. And they said unequivocally that we're leaving money on the table, that most states have full-time grant writers. And in my opinion, we should have a centralized full-time grant writer that is working for the counties. And I'm sure that person would more than pay for themselves. Now, whether that needs to be a state position or how that works, but I think that you should explore that. Thank you.
Mr. Riemann.
Mr. Chairman, we are meeting at Rock Springs the next week. We'll bring this up in our committee structure. When you mention this topic, it kind of reminds me that just a couple of years ago, the governor requested some local government support within the Office of State Lands and Investments. And in fact, I believe you all funded a position there to help on the state side and to help with some technical expertise. But I don't know that this grant funding piece was a part of that. So we can certainly have those conversations, explore other, one idea perhaps is to have a position in our office that could support that, but we'll explore all of those things and be happy to engage with you on that topic. That'd be great.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So I think that wraps up the day. We're back here tomorrow morning at 8:30.
Mr. Chairman, I had one more item.
Yes, please.
looking through. And Mr. Garrett said that he would share model legislation. So does the committee also want, depending on how Mr. Garrett and the counties work together, would the committee like to see something what they come up with to work with LSO for some draft legislation for the next meeting, not the June meeting?
I think so, yes. Yeah, do that. No sense reinventing the wheel if we don't have to. So with this room, I know it'll probably be secured, but you probably want to take your stuff with you.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, back to that grant writer. Over 30 years ago, I lived in Gillette for quite a few years, and the Campbell County had their own grant writer. And that grant writer helped other counties write grants also. I don't know if they still have that position, but boy, that really paid off for Campbell County in the 80s.
Thanks, Senator. So I'd take your stuff with you and Co-Chairman Landon will chair tomorrow. And we're done early. That's a message, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just, I'm telling the committee, bring your seat belts. And we're gonna put the hammer down tomorrow. We'll be driving past the speed limit and we're gonna get out of here. We have people that